The first word of God sounded, where there was neither heaven nor earth. And it detached from his stone and fell to the second time and declared his divinity. And the whole immensity of the eternal shook. And his word was a measure of grace, a flash of grace, and it broke and pierced the spine of the mountains. Who was born when he came down? Great Father, you know it. The first principle was born and bore the back of the mountains. Who was born there? Who? Father, you know it. He who is tender in heaven was born. Book of Spirits, Codex of Shillambalam de Chuiamal. And no one ascended to heaven except the one who came down from heaven, the Son of Man who is in heaven. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so it is necessary that the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. St. John 3:14-16. At every given moment all the future of the world is predestined and existing, but it is predestined conditionally, i.e., there must be one or another future in accordance with the direction of events of the given moment, if no new factor comes in. And a new factor can only come in from the side of consciousness and the will resulting from it. It is important to understand and assimilate this. P.D.F. Penspi, Tertium Organum.
First book. I could never understand this strange man of measured word, who seemed to delight in confusing me with his caustic and paradoxical observations on everything. He gave the impression of being reserved, but shortly after dealing with him, one could not help but noticing the most extraordinary fact that I have known in my agitated life. He was a smile. He was a smile from head to toe. He wasn't smiling, he didn't need to smile, all of him was that smile. This impression also came to me in a very curious way and difficult to explain. I will only say that the smile seemed a natural property of his body, and that it emanated even from the way he walked. I never heard him laugh, but he had the gift of communicating his happiness or seriousness, according to a situation. I never saw him depressed or upset, not even during those turbulent days that happened towards the end of the Second World War when, as a result of a political revolution, I went to jail and he did absolutely nothing to obtain my freedom. Even in that incident he proved to be an unusual man. He even seemed determined that I continue to be imprisoned, and one time when I reproached him for this attitude, he said to me, "You are much better here than out there. At least here you are in good company and you may even wake up. But you cannot even sleep here," I said. "That is what you think because you still don't know which form of sleep is more dangerous and damaging in the long run. There are those who watch with you even when you sleep, and you are in good company." In the section of my prison there were also many men whom I respected as having intellectual values, and conversations with them were interesting to me. With some of them I played endless games of chess, but our talks always followed the course of the political events that had culminated in our imprisonment. This is what I made my friend see one afternoon when he visited me loaded with Christmas presents. "You're still sleeping," was his entire reply. That day we chatted for a long time, and it occurred to me to ask him, "How is it that you come to visit me so often and have not disappeared like the others who fled as soon as they found out about my situation? I am more than a friend, I am the friendship that unites us." I could not avoid a smile, with which I wanted to tell him that this was not the right time to throw his paradoxes at me, and I insisted. "But how is it that the police have not arrested you, knowing that you are my closest friend?" His response was as incomprehensible as everything else. "Friendship protects me. And it protects you too, albeit in another way." And after a moment of silence, he added, "You don't understand me because you still depend on them, just as they depend on you. Neither you nor they depend on yourself yet, but all of you are convinced otherwise. If you could only understand this, you would understand everything else in due time. This infuriated me and I replied violently. I told him that his words were very interesting as a philosophy in the nights of boredom, but that in the circumstances in which I found myself they are an unbearable nonsense. Besides, I added, very excited and using terms impossible to publish, how am I going to depend on these, since the only thing they are good for is to lick the boots of that little operetta dictator? Or maybe I also depend on an imbecile that uses force and boasts his popularity when his opposition is silenced. Do I also depend on those who pursue intelligence and talk about progress? I wouldn't be surprised if you told me so now. He looked at me with his constant and patient smile, listened until I finished talking, and offering me cigarettes and matches, he replied, "You said it. You also depend on him, as well as on many other things. They," and he gestured to the armed guards who were on the other side of the gate, "support him with their weapons because they cannot do anything other than obey the one who knows how to command them. Without weapons, without uniforms and without bosses, they would be nothing. They believe they are the masters of their weapons, but in reality they are slaves to them. But you and those who are imprisoned here with you are worse. They wear uniforms because they are afraid of walking alone in life, and because they cannot do anything more productive for the world, they also wear a uniform on their heads. However, you are worse. You say that you are men of intellect, but in reality you are fools in love with your foolishness. You support this dictatorship and whatever other dictatorship there is. You support them much better and more efficiently than the others. Your support occurs in many ways, but mainly through the attitude of stupid arrogance that makes you live with your backs to the truth. And not only are you supporting it, but you are also strengthening it. Yes, you are worse than those who are honestly ignorant. And yet, none of you are truly at fault." He told me all this so calmly and seriously that I was speechless. Some time has passed before I asked him, "What is it that we ignore?" "A very simple fact that is actually a physical truth, but that you all believe is only an ethical precept that is impossible to put into practice. Surely you have read or heard it at some point. Do not resist evil. All these precepts were given to the world by true sages. Only a handful of beings in human history have been able to discover that they are truly scientific truths. Ordinary science, by the way, will deny this because it believes that ethics is something separate from what it calls matter, without realizing that it is precisely what conditions and vivifies matter and even creates its forms. Long ago there was a true sage among men of science and his name was Mesmer. Science, or what they call science, persecuted him and his foreworks have been ignored. Such is the destiny of everyone who discovers the truth. Today mesmerism is associated with a form of charlatanism, and the curious thing is that it is precisely the charlatans of science who speak the most against Mesmer's charlatanism. Some who have studied Mesmer for magnetic healings have approached the truth that he concealed in his aphorisms. But only a few, very few, have warned that what is yes can also be no, that yes is a truth relative to no, as good is relative to bad. But you will have a chance to find out about this because you have finally asked me a worthwhile question. I must confess that the words of this friend always seemed crazy to me. That afternoon he left more content and cheerful than usual, promising me a new visit in 2 days, which, according to the prison regulations, was extremely difficult. When I looked at him, he told me, "Do you know how to ride a bike?" Of course I answered, "Good. He who knows how to ride his own bicycle can ride any other." What on earth did a bicycle have to do with his visit? Many times I asked myself this and other questions arising from his words. I still keep asking myself without finding an adequate answer. I must also confess that reason told me that this man was crazy, but I felt a singular affection for him. I wanted to represent him like this, acting in an important circumstance in my life, in that event that marked the end of a career to which I had given all my strength and all my enthusiasm. It was truly a rough blow that I suffered when I lost that circumstance that I achieved after long years of hard work. But when I said all these things to my friend, he just replied, "It is the best thing that could have happened to you. Now it only depends on you that your awakening does not cause you greater suffering." And then he told me many things that at the time I took as words that he wanted to comfort me with, insisting that I possessed certain personal qualities indicative of the promise of awakening.
I entered journalism because after one of the many wars of this century, I was left with a leg so damaged that it was impossible for me to resume my profession in the merchant marine. Knowing some languages, being able to translate Morse code, and not write badly were factors that helped me in this endeavor. I was ambitious, and I wanted to pursue a career because I felt very strongly that my health was working against me and that the years were getting shorter and shorter. I renounced the adventures and joys that aimless travel produces, akin to when I joined as a crew member on any ship, in any port. I also renounced poetry and many other things that until then had made my existence happy. It was unpleasant to walk on a cane, and it was even more unpleasant that at times I had to use crutches. I did not have the money necessary for a specialist to treat my leg properly, and from my homeland I had fled in terror where there was little maternal protection of military hospitals. I had very good reasons to do this, having seen too many things. But this has only the value of a personal history. I earned the minimum salary, working with a desire to prosper and with enthusiasm. Not only did I want to pursue a career and make a name for myself in journalism, but I also realized that as long as I depended on the cane one day, and on the crutches the next depending on how crowded it was on the trams that I had to use to go and come back from my job, my possibilities in life were circumscribed to being a translator and nothing else. So my first goal was to make money. And as through heritage and education I had a certain religious ideas, I considered that the best thing was to ask heaven for help. I thought about making my requests to some of the saints who are credited with miracles, but my work made me reject this decision. The news reported on the world situation on the eve of the Second World War and on that lamentable puppet comedy in Geneva. That event affected me deeply and ended up undermining my belief in saints. I could not explain to myself how it was possible that with so much prayer, with so much solicitous supplication to the saints, the world could continue to embark on an orgy of blood that I had experienced in my own flesh and about which my cane and my crutches spoke eloquently, without the need for this truth to be corroborated by the acute pains I used to suffer. In the midst of all this, I consoled myself by thinking that I still had my leg and I had a chance to save it. Others had ended up worse than me. They lost legs or arms with injuries of much less importance than mine. All this, apart from other things that were too intimate, made my spirit determined to put aside the idea of asking for monetary help from Saint Judas Tadeo, or Saint Pancrazio, or any of the other saints who, in theory and according to religious propaganda, were often performing miracles. I decided to present my concerns directly and personally to our Lord Jesus Christ. After all, I always felt that the prayer "My Lord Jesus Christ," as well as "Hail Mary," moved me powerfully. And so I began to visit various temples in search of a suitable environment until I found one in which there was a beautiful painting of the heart of Jesus that dominated the altar and the central nave. But, at this point, it is necessary for me to confess that I had stopped going to Mass on Sundays and holidays because in those days I preferred to stay in bed, in the modest boarding house where I had a room, in order to give a good rest to my leg. In addition, I felt the remorse of conscience. I considered that the holy sacraments were forever forbidden to me. This had its origin in the war. I had a violent clash with the chaplain of my unit when, in despair, I told him that I thought that God was rubbish and that he could not explain to me how it was possible that through his ministers he sanctioned such a killing of young people. This incident occurred after a mass at the front, as several hundred boys aged 16 to 18 entered to receive their baptism of fire. The chaplain had offered me communion, saying, "Just in case you die." This disgusted me so much that I violently emptied all the anger that had accumulated in me during a year of living in a shirt that was seething with lice, without water and starving. I am a violent man, and at that time I pulled the trigger easily, as if the most natural function of life was to take a life from your fellow man. I don't remember what exactly I said that day, but, in general, it was understandable to me that men who know nothing about religion turned into beasts, but I found it totally incomprehensible that religious people sanctioned and even blessed those who gave themselves to such outrage. I never forgot that scene. I came out of combat without a scratch, but deeply moved after having seen so many young boys die, almost defenseless. The chaplain, who had helped rescue the wounded under enemy fire, sat next to me on a tree trunk, put an arm around my shoulders when I burst into tears, and told me that he understood my state of mind. For an instant I thought I was crying with regret, but I soon realized that it was the nervous tension resulting from the fight that made me falter. However, in my consciousness persisted the feeling of having committed a sacrilege because of what I have said about God. Therefore I considered myself unworthy to receive the holy sacraments. And, to be honest, I also feared the penance that would result from confessing such a thing. For this reason, and perhaps also because I wanted to atone for my sin, in my own way, as long as it was not very uncomfortable to do so, I went to that temple only in the afternoons when it was more or less empty. In the aftermath of the war, one had naturally lost all faith in miracles. On the other hand, the international news, which I had to translate daily, told me that miracles belonged to times too remote to take them into account. It is true that from time to time a paragraph would arrive announcing some miraculous cure in Lourdes. But the miracle that I was waiting for was far from happening, because I was waiting for the miracle of peace. What had happened to me in my country was happening to Ethiopians and Italians in Africa. Shortly after, for the sake of supposedly noble principles and with the participation of religion and religious people, it began to occur in Spain. Luckily at that time I knew deep down that for me there would be no miracle unless I did on my own, and at my own risk, what I needed to do. However, I could not hide in my heart that deep faith in Jesus Christ. And even though I had blasphemed saying that I considered God to be rubbish, the reason indicated to me that if I took to the letter the principle that He is in heaven, on earth and everywhere, I would lose nothing by making Him see or explaining to Him that Christ suffered in the war. I thought that in time I might also be able to persuade Him to help me earn enough money to treat my leg so that I could work normally. So when I arrived at the church, I prayed very hastily, "Our Father, my Lord Jesus Christ, and Hail Mary." Immediately I would go to that beautiful image of the heart of Jesus, saying, "My Lord Jesus Christ, I am not asking much of you. I know you can't give me to win the lottery, and even if it were possible for you to do so, I am not interested in that much money. Nor am I going to ask you to help me find an heiress. At the moment I don't want to get married. Besides, what heiress will want to marry me when she finds out that I only want her to pay for my leg surgery? Only a very ugly woman would do it, and I don't want to marry an ugly woman. I don't want to marry a very pretty one either, because, if in addition to being pretty she is also rich, she will surely be stupid and hollow. Do you know what my grandfather used to say? He said, 'Let a wise man give me death, but not a brute life.' You know well that I have this in my blood. For this reason, my Lord Jesus Christ, all I ask of you is something that everyone seems to despise as useless and superfluous. I ask you for intelligence. Just help me to have more intelligence, and I will manage from there and will not bother you any more. One of my counted qualities is perseverance when something interests me vitally. What I wanted back then was to break through and become a great international correspondent. To do this, at the boarding house and at night, I would rehearse the most sensational articles I could imagine based on what I was learning from my work. I created a series of political events of which I was a privileged witness. I knew well that these were crazy dreams, but I enjoyed having them. It was also wonderful to notice that somewhere in my being there was someone capable of dreaming. Little by little, based on the experience that my work gave me, I began to write articles on the international situation. I very much enjoyed forecasting what would happen as a result of a given event. These forecasts were based on certain phenomena for which I noticed that they are continuously repeating themselves in virtually every major event. They seemed to obey a principle, and this principle governed the acts of great men. This made me resume the study of history that had especially attracted me in school. I began to understand it from another point of view, realizing at the same time that this repetition had occurred automatically from the most remote times. It was all about understanding the motives. The motives were always the same and they animated everything. So when my predictions began to be fulfilled with more or less precision, I decided to intensify my requests to Jesus Christ. I made them more serious and larger. I wrote down my forecasts in a notebook, and after a few months I began to do my work very efficiently and more quickly, which produced a slight increase in my salary. I also earned some extra pesos writing articles signed with some assumed name, referring to the author as a great internationalist, and dating them in any European capital. The newspapers that bought this material from me had a weakness for Anglo-Saxon names. I therefore felt obliged to express my gratitude in some way and decided to go to the temple earlier and stay there longer. I began my pleas very meticulously. My Lord Jesus Christ, thank you for listening to me. Every time I see more clearly. My salary has already been increased, but the operation costs much more, so please give me more intelligence so that I will not continue to bother you in this way. I also detailed my personal problems and asked for advice, saying, "Illuminate me so I can understand more clearly." This attendance at the temple became a beneficial habit and, of course, economic, because while my friends played dice in bars or went to the cinema to entertain themselves, I would go to pray. And the money that otherwise I would have spent with them turned into a growing sum that I was depositing in a saving account. I waited impatiently for the day when it would be possible for me to give up the limp, the cane, and the crutch, and embark on the great adventure of putting down translations to pursue a career as a chronicler of sensational affairs. It was then when I met my friend. Like me, this man of concentrated appearance always occupied the same spot in the temple. He prayed with great devotion. I was drawn to such a unique way of praying. He did not move his lips, his face did not have a serious expression but was completely serene. He prayed with his arms in the form of a cross, without taking his eyes off the image of Jesus Christ. Often, by watching him, I was distracted from my own prayers. I thought that maybe it would be good to have that power of concentration and to be able to address our Lord Jesus Christ properly. But when I noticed such wishes in me, the idea of imitating him displeased me. My grandfather had always told me that one should pray with what is in the heart and not with the head. I had never bothered to delve into these things, and for reasons that had arisen from my upbringing, I strictly refused to recite the classical prayers except those that moved me. At school I had received many very painful spankings due to my impertinences about the real and practical meaning of prayers. But there was no spanking strong enough to overcome my stubbornness, and my teachers had with them managed to turn me into a stubborn rebel. This man seemed to accurately measure the length of his prayers. He always came before me. I never saw him come in after me. But he finished a minute or two earlier than me. He crossed himself in a very solemn way, though without the slightest affectation. I noticed that he held his hand at the established points longer than the priests themselves did. One afternoon it occurred to me that perhaps crossing oneself in that way had a very special meaning. This man also did not dip his fingers in the holy water basin. He was leaving very quietly. After a few days, realizing that I was observing his actions, he began to greet me by bowing his head slightly. That was when I noticed that there was something out of the ordinary about his appearance. His expression when greeting me was very kind, but he also indicated great strength. And when I was leaving the temple to go to work, I would see him in the stairs lighting or smoking a cigarette. One afternoon when the news was more abundant and critical than usual, I left the temple at the same time as him, in a hurry to arrive earlier to work. When we got to the door we collided. My limp was an obstacle, and in order to let him pass first, I made a sharp movement and dropped my cane to the ground. Instead of leaving, he immediately bent down and handed it to me saying, "Excuse me, please." It was awkward on my part. I was astonished because there was no doubt that I had been the clumsy one in my 12 childish desire to gain the lead, and only when I had realized that the cane could cause him to stumble had I dropped it. Needless to say, I was already quite used to people scolding me because of my clumsiness, especially in trams. On one occasion, and in the same church, a very devout lady had rebuked me by tripping over the cane that I had inadvertently left beside me. And when apologizing for my negligence, she said to me, "For something God has punished you in that way, inconsiderate." I did not doubt for a moment that this lady was correct, since I had sinned so gravely against God in the war, so I assumed that her words were a warning to be more careful with the cane, as it caused a nuisance to a lady of such devotion. I also thought that the warnings included an admonition never to go to the temple on crutches. The lady had rushed to the confessional where there was a long queue of ladies waiting their turn. When I looked at the one whom I had wronged so much, I realized that the guilt also fell on me for having caused her to lose at least 2 places in line, due to the time it took to remind me of my sins and blasphemies. She was circling her rosary with nervous and agitated hands, and I gathered that this lady actually needed to confess in a hurry. I relate this incident because a certain resignation had already settled in me to receive the curses of the good people who were so bothered by my cane and limp. So when this strange man apologized to me for something of which I was the only one to blame, I didn't know what to say. So surprised was I at such a novelty. I remember trying to say something, but I don't know if I was able to modulate the words. He opened the narrow door very carefully, stepped aside and invited me. "You come in first, please. Surely you are in a hurry." I only managed to bow my head in gratitude. Only by being outside was I able to partially recover from my amazement, and I said, "You know well that it was my fault. You are very kind. Thanks a lot." It is necessary here to highlight something very unique that I felt at that time. The respect he had shown produced a curious irritation in me. I waited for him to respond with the familiar "by no means." I eagerly wanted for him to answer in this way, since that would have me disillusioned. What reason was there for me to feel such a strange wish? I still can't explain it. But he didn't say that, and then another unusual thing occurred. I felt a lively joy at his slight and silent nod. And to myself I commented, "Good thing this one is not a slob." After his pardon, he walked away from me. I began to descend the steps of the temple with that typical clumsiness of the lame who can only descend 1 step at a time. And that day the descent was excruciatingly slow for me. I felt behind me the sensation that he was watching me and that he felt sorry for me. In general, the compassion that some expressed for my lameness had a taste of hypocrisy, and it irritated me a lot. I called this a false mercy, a banal formula like any other. Once again I had to change my mind about this man. My judgment had been very impulsive. When I got to the sidewalk, I looked back and saw him walk away in the opposite direction from mine, as if nothing had happened. I did not recall this incident until the other day when he had arrived at the temple. Due to certain arrangements that were being made inside, the benches where he and I used to pray were not in the usual position. This man had occupied the end of the only bench from which you could look directly at the altar, and that end was attached to a thick pillar. I settled on the same bench, but a little away from him, and I was careful to place my cane behind me on the seat. When he had finished his prayers, he sat down. I did not realize this fact until I in turn had finished and was preparing to leave. The man had waited patiently because to leave he would have had to interrupt me. Such delicacy moved me, all the more so since I had already become aware of his custom of leaving the temple as soon as he finished his prayers. I looked at him, smiled at him and said, "Thank you very much, sir." He nodded again, stood up, and waited for me to adjust my leg position and pick up the cane. I tried to do it as quickly as possible in order to correspond to his delicacy, and as a result of a sudden movement I felt such a sharp pain that, without realizing it, I exclaimed, "Shit." I already had the cane in my right hand. I let it drop to lean on the back of the bench, and with my left hand I was able to touch the sore part of my leg. When I was bent over I realized what I just said, and raised my head to look at this man, feeling that his face was flushed with shame. But he was quietly smiling, and with the same loving and kind expression, he said as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "Amen." So awkward was the shock that this produced in me that I could not contain my laughter, and it was necessary for me to cover my mouth with my hand to avoid causing a scandal. I had just said something outrageous in the presence of this man who, by all accounts, took religion very seriously. However, not only had he not been violent or annoyed, but he even dispelled my shame and guilt in such a way that I was in the most honest hilarity. Because just as I am violent, I have an easy laugh. One goes with the other. I made an effort and recovered as I could, taking the cane and began to go out with my usual awkwardness. This man did not even make a gesture to help me, and for that I was grateful. His amen was already a notable concession to my weakness. When we were outside, however, I felt compelled to give him an explanation, so I stopped him and said, "Sir, I beg your pardon." Believe me, it was an involuntary exclamation. The pain was very acute, I understand, he said. Such pain is truly acute. Given the circumstances, your exclamation is natural. You don't have to apologize to me. I have to admit that it was a long time before I understood his phrase. Even now it seems inexplicable to me. But at the time I didn't even think about it, since I was concerned with formulating my apologies and answering with decency to the respect that he had for me. So I said, "I realize my exclamation must have hurt your devotion. You have been very respectful towards me, and I would not like to displease you. After all, my devotion is not the same as yours. I do not come to the temple to worship or to ask forgiveness for my sins, because I know that there is no forgiveness for them, and that, furthermore, I do not deserve it. I come to ask for help with needs that have little to do with spirituality. As you can see, I add one sin to another, and all because of a pain in my leg." It was on this occasion that he threw his first paradox on me. Speaking very deliberately and slowly, he said, "Just like good and virtue, sin and evil can only occur in vigil. Who sleeps, sleeps. For the asleep there is no sin, as there is no good or virtue. There is only sleep." I looked at him, expressing some suspicion of being in front of a madman, but his gaze was so clean, he was so fixed on my eyes, without being impertinent, that I hesitated before completing my judgment. I said nothing. He continued. Actually, no one sins deliberately, no one can deliberately do wrong. In sleep, things are as they are, and it is the only way that they can be. When one sleeps, they have no control or dominance over what happens when sleeping. I confess that I cannot understand you, I said. It is only natural that it is so. Forget this incident that is not of major importance, but I'm afraid that I have hurt you with that completely involuntary expression. No, you didn't hurt me in any way. You hurt yourself. The vast majority of men hurt themselves in this way, precisely because almost everything they think, feel and do is involuntary. I would like to be able to understand you. What you tell me is very confusing, and I regret that my concerns do not allow me to reflect on the meaning of your words. Even in sleep, man has a certain power of choice, very limited indeed, but he has it. However, when he exercises it, this power increases. If his interest in understanding is sincere and deep, it will not be difficult for him to realize that the sleeping man can choose between waking up and continuing to sleep. I was not interested in riddles of this kind. However, I was attracted to the way this man spoke. But I was in a hurry to get to my office to see whether or not my latest forecast had come true. In addition, the general crisis in Europe made us all very busy, so that my mind was not predisposed to meditate on the things I had just heard. In order not to be rude, I said, "Surely what you say is very true. At least, in my case it is. I am relieved not to have offended you in your religious feelings. I will try to be more careful in the future. Now I beg your pardon, as I have to go to work." I was about to say the usual "see you later" when he interrupted me. "I have no fixed course, so if you will allow me, I will accompany you." I had always avoided the company of friends and acquaintances, knowing that my limp made them impatient since I had to do little more than drag my injured leg. And I was about to say no, that I was in a great hurry, when I realized the incongruity of my apology. I could not, in any way, tell him that I need to walk fast. Not knowing what to do, I only managed to tell him, with the greatest pleasure. But inwardly I was boiling with rage. This man imposed himself on my will in such a gentle, yet determined way, that I could not hide my irritation, and so I began to walk quietly. Each of his gestures was, however, considerate. As I struggled down the steps of the temple to the sidewalk, he told me that he would go ahead to buy cigarettes. When we were together again, he played with the package, and when we reached the corner he did not offer that merciful gesture, which irritated me so much in others, of helping me to cross the street. He walked beside me very naturally, as if my pace was that of someone who walks normally. However, it seems to me that he caught my inner irritation, and he said to me, "The pain that bothers you now is the one that you expressed in the church. I would be glad if I can remove it from you." This only increased my irritation. I was about to tell him that compassion made me sick, and that, anyway, he couldn't really care if I was in pain or not. But something held me back, so I kept silent. We walked at my pace, very slowly. For a while we were both silent. I began to remember that on more than one occasion I had also truly wished that the pain suffered by those more seriously injured people, especially in blood hospitals, would disappear. So I thought maybe this man was not a hypocrite in telling me how he felt about me. I began to feel calmer, and at the same time I had more confidence in him. He offered me a cigarette, and observing my gesture of looking for matches in my pocket, with the cane hanging from my arm, he let me do it. I felt sympathy for him, and decided to entrust him with my shameful secret. I hope I'm not offending you with what I'm going to say, but the reality is that I go to church to see if prayers could help me to gain a little more understanding with 16, which to perform better at my job. I hope that way I will earn a raise in salary. I need it and I work overtime to pay for my leg surgery and to stay healthy. But don't think that I expect a miracle to happen to me. I also ask for other things that are perhaps very petty. I understand, he said. I hope I can shortly gather the necessary sum. When I can walk well, I will be able to work better and build a career and a name. It seems you have a very precise purpose. Well, without a precise purpose there is very little one can do, I said to him. It is a great thing to have a precise purpose, to know what you want. It is much more important than most people imagine. But very few men really know what they want in life. Some think they know, but they don't. They confuse the ends with the means they use, and it sometimes happens that the means are their true end. But since they see them as means, because they cannot see more or better, they use great and sublime means for rather petty ends. This is how knowledge is prostituted. This comment produced a discomfort in me, and I replied, "Are you referring to my case, to the fact that I do not go to church for spiritual reasons?" "No," he answered, "I speak in general. I do not think that you have authorized me to speak directly of your private matters. For the rest, when I want to say something, I say it directly and bluntly. Perhaps my attitude in church will call your attention. But it is the case that I do not know how to pray, nor do I know how to worship. I only know how to ask, and I ask in my own way. Religion ceased to interest me for many reasons, but it seems that you haven't lost faith, and that's the only thing that really matters. Even more so in your particular case. There is much to say about faith. It is something that must grow in man. And as for knowing how to pray, it is simpler than you suppose. In our times, the meaning of prayer has become very complicated. But very few men, I think, that when you know what you want and you fight to achieve it, even when you don't put it into words, you are in permanent prayer. I once read somewhere that all deep wanting is a prayer and that it never goes unanswered. Man always receives what he asks for. But since man generally does not know what his heart really wants, he also does not know how to ask for what is best for him. Hence, he considers that the Our Father, for example, is a prayer accessible only to a heart thirsty for truth and hungry for good. Every true miracle rests on that, but modern man no longer sees it in this way, and he has also lost the true meaning of the miraculous. He seeks for it outside himself, in the phenomenal. Modern man has forgotten many simple things, and this forgetfulness is the underlying truth in the concept of the original sin. "I don't believe in miracles," I replied. "1. It is possible that such is your formulation. But allow me to question your words. How can I not know what I myself believe? The facts reveal that. It is very simple, if you observe them well. If you didn't believe in the miraculous, you wouldn't go to church." And without giving me a chance to respond, he said goodbye, saying, "I have really enjoyed your company. Thank you. Perhaps we can return to these topics if you have an interest in them. Are you going to church tomorrow?" "For sure," I told him, "if I am alive, and if God allows it," he added seriously. I was confused. This last expression had bothered me. At times this man appeared as the common sense incarnate, but here his paradoxes and his contradictions tormented me. Anyway, I told myself, at least he is honest and he is not a slob. The next day we walked together again, and the next day also. and thus a beautiful and sincere friendship was consolidated between us. His paradoxes hit me only from time to time. He made sure that I was fed well, and that I got enough rest. He persuaded me to give up the extra work that deprived me of sleep and rest. He helped me make my predictions, and soon I had several notebooks full of notes. But what seemed to have worried him the most was my leg. And so one day he timidly ventured to tell me, "I have discussed your case with a surgeon friend of mine. If you can pay for the X-ray, he will do the operation for free. Hospital expenses, anesthesia, ward, etc., you can pay monthly. Are you interested?" "Of course," I exclaimed. I was full of joy. By that time we became closer and we knew each other better. I was attracted to his frank and open way of doing things, especially the way he was throwing his opinions without caring about mine. But he stopped talking about religious topics, and I wondered why. I obtained permission from my bosses to be absent from the office, and they even provided me with an advance on future salaries, so that I could fill in the amounts that were missing. That memorable afternoon my friend was waiting for me at the door of the church. "We are late," he said, "let's catch a taxi." During the trip he did not speak anything, and neither did I, except, "It is a pity that this afternoon I could not pray. I would have liked to give my thanks for all of this." "Don't worry about that," he answered. "They are given, received, and you are at peace with him." I didn't even have time to be surprised, because at that moment we arrived at the clinic and he anticipated paying the driver. Those 5 weeks went by so quickly that I can hardly remember the details. He visited me every day, and has taken care of some personal matters that I could not attend to. When the doctor authorized me to get up and try walking, he stayed away. My first days without a cane, even at the clinic, were quite unpleasant. I had gotten into the habit of limping, and so I missed the cane. My friend told me, "Every habit is an acquired thing, and it is possible to change it. Do this test." And putting a box of matches in my hand, he indicated to me, "Squeeze it in your hand as if it is the handle of the cane." After some rehearsals I began to notice that doing it that way made me feel safer and I walked better. Time passed and I was discharged. That day my friend came looking for me and we left the clinic together. When I thanked the surgeon for his kindness for not having charged me for the operation, I noticed that he was embarrassed. Much later I learned that this embarrassment was due to the fact that my friend had paid all the expenses. He never gave me a chance to thank him for this gesture. When we left the clinic and I happily walked by his side, he made one of his paradoxical commentary. People believe that habits are let go of when in reality one can only change them. The wisdom of man is proved precisely in what habits he changes and which he adopts in place of the ones he thinks he leaves behind. I tell you this with a double purpose. The main one is that you learn to know yourself, the other is to indicate to you a detail by which you can take the thread of this knowledge that some very wise men consider indispensable for human happiness. For example, now you are squeezing the box of matches, and hide this habit by carrying your hand hidden in your pocket. This is not particularly harmful. I am saying this only so that you learn to observe yourself, for now it is enough that you know this. You could have continued to believe that you have left behind the habit of walking with the cane, but what you have left behind is only the cane and not the habit of leaning on something to walk. Now you are leaning on a box of matches. I don't know if you understand what I am trying to tell you. I took my hand out of my pocket immediately, somewhat embarrassed, but he said, "No, that was not my intention. You have not understood me. You see, you could have changed the habit of walking supported on something for the habit of reacting with an exaggerated self-esteem, and that would be really harmful. The wise thing is to have discernment in these things, in these trifles, because all that is great is made out of trifles." When we want to be better and we do not know precisely and by ourselves what is better or what is worse, we easily fall into absurdities and we enslave ourselves to what others determine what is better or worse. In every human being there is a judge always ready to guide us. But due to our bad education and the consequences of it and other things, either we ignore this interior judge or, when he speaks to us, we do not pay due attention to him. This judges ourselves in a different way, let's say invisible. I would dare to say that in your case it was this judge who made you go to church and who has guided you through many of your tribulations. Remembering this judge, practicing his presence in yourself, is something very important. And since it is about an aspect that we can say is superior to ourselves, we can call this judge I. But not that ordinary I we know. We nourish him by striving to feel him in each of our actions, our feelings, and our thoughts. Eventually we may come to see it as something extremely extraordinary, highly intelligent, and comprehensive. It is a very different sensation and feeling than what we are used to think as I. It does not appear overnight, but rather you have to forge it patiently. But enough for now. Give some thought to that, I beg you. Do you like cycling? I answered yes. Great, he said. If you want, when I return from a trip that I must do now, we can go on a series of rides together. Fortunately I have two, one is from a brother who died. Would you like to go on those rides? I think so, I said. And actually, free of my lameness, I felt that the world was a wonderful thing. I said goodbye to my friend. The next day I went to the church much earlier than usual. I expressed my gratitude to Jesus, and when I was murmuring my improvised speech, I remembered the words of my friend in our first talk. If you didn't believe in the miraculous, you wouldn't go to church. I realized that in everything I had just lived a miracle had occurred, but I was not entirely convinced. It had all happened too casually, and besides, I was used to thinking that for miracles to be real, they have to happen in a few seconds. Mine had taken about a year and this was not, for me, a miracle. Perhaps whoever reads this can explain the reason why in me there was a voice, an idea, a something that insisted that the miracle had occurred, but I cannot find any that completely satisfies me, despite the fact that my friend spoke to me often about the illusion of time. In what he asked me to publish there is a mention of time and love that, frankly, I don't understand. I have limited myself to copying the sheets that he gave me. But let's come back to him. As I already mentioned, I never knew his name, his real name. Sometimes he said that names are unimportant, that what is truly important is closer to us than our own name, that it is more real than our name. He said that names are only a social convenience, a means of identifying oneself. He sometimes said that he felt identified with certain and strange bees of Yucatan, sometimes with a Prince Kanik who had been loved by Princess Saknicht. At other times he used to say that his love for the sun urged him to feel of the same spirit as a certain Inca named Yahuahuacac whose concerns he had shared for a while despite the fact that there was a large amount of time between them. Other times he confided to me that he was in love with the wisdom of Ions and with some of the things of Melchizedek. Very often I heard him comment, "The only thing that really matters is to be. When man is, the rest that he has is by addition." In my notes from that time, I found some of his words written down. Time, the development of life and human events is something that very few take into account and that an even smaller number are capable of understanding. Life is a miracle in itself, but we rarely ponder over it. We take for granted many things that are not true, that would cease to be true if we applied a question to them, a why. We do not know who we really are, or what we really are, what inclinations are those that really drive us. Few are the ones that are convinced of this. Most believe that with the name, the profession, and some other circumstantial things, they already know everything. Our way of thinking is still very naive. Much of what men attribute to modern education has to be sought in the depths of the purest psychology, which is something that has been lost. But it also happens that there are many psychologists who do not even understand the things that they themselves say. Otherwise, they would have long ago discarded psychoanalysis. Ordinary science does not believe or accept the miraculous because it is not truly scientific. There are men of science who occasionally and for moral reasons tend to talk about the spiritual, but do not even stop to ponder what is matter in itself. There are supposedly spiritual men who do not realize the transcendence of what Jesus Christ said to Nicodemus, and that the gospel records with these words. If I have told you of earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? And the thing is that science does not want to note that in the words, the parables, the miracles and all the known facts of Jesus Christ there is much more science than we can normally imagine. Because of this, the philosophy that we know is based on unscientific novelties, just as the Christian religion that we know is at odds with the main truths that Christ taught. But we must not despair. There are those who hold the keys to true science and their knowledge is exact and precise, and one cannot go wrong about them. The only difficulty is that to this science and to this knowledge nobody arrives by chance. You need to eagerly search for them and prepare yourself for a long time. But we can all get in touch with these men, we can make contact through their ideas and, above all, through the effort we make to understand these ideas. It is the sincere effort that counts. There is a lot of this, especially in literature. Few suspect that a little book that costs only a few pennies contains the most wonderful teachings one could wish for. As I say, we think very naively, or better said, we do not know how to think. Science and philosophy, for example, use means that, if pondered over them, would turn them into ends. One of such mean is known by the name of intuition. Science ignores how much it owes to intuition. The same thing happens with philosophy. It is a different gradation or speed of the function of human intelligence. The same can be said of art and religion. The revelations on which religious dogma is based are something that all theologians want to elaborate without realizing that at the speed at which ordinary reason works, it is a material impossible of elaboration. What little book is that which costs a few pennies? I asked. The Sermon on the Mount. It is the sum of chapters 5, 6 and 7 of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Why does religion say nothing about this? My friend looked at me and smiled. Religion does not realize that its error lies precisely in the concept that it has of religion. However, in order to understand the truth of this concept, it is necessary to discard the usual concept. I was stunned by such gibberish. But you are obviously a religious man. How can you say that? You see, he said, you cannot get out of the coffin in which you were put by your education, your concept of religious morality, and so on. Many men tend to see the possibility of getting out of the coffin, and understand the word coffin literally. They stick their heads over the edges, but the idea of freedom that they see frightens them and they soon slip back into their coffin and even bolt the lid shut so that nothing will disturb their sleep. But why do you tell me that religion is a wrong concept? Religion means relinking, and there is nothing to relink because there is nothing in the universe that is detached from something. However, we must represent things as if they were detached due to the limitations of our senses and the understanding that we derive from this limitation. How could the concept of religion be reconciled with what the most elementary part of the Catechism affirms, for example, that God is in heaven, on earth and everywhere? Or that other affirmation of one of the Church Fathers, the Apostle Paul, who said, "In God we live, we move and we have our being." So what is there to do? To realize what the word universe means, to strive to raise intelligence to those states of sharpness in which these ideas are a living thing. Again, we can resort to the interview that Nicodemus had with Jesus, because on the same subject Jesus gave the key to understanding these things by saying, and no one ascended into heaven, except he who came down from heaven, the Son of Man who is in heaven. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so it is necessary that the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. This is extremely difficult to understand. It all depends on the effort made to understand it. The effort to understand these statements that seem so obscure is precisely the key that can open the doors of heaven for us, but it happens that majority of people settle for the first interpretation they find, forgetting the effort, and thus begin to fall, and the original sin begins. Because it means to stop the development of intelligence. When this development stops, when man is satisfied with today's understanding and does not try to expand it to the maximum intensity of which he is capable, he loses his capacity, loses his understanding, and eventually loses his soul, or better said, he mutilates, obstructing his growth in such a way that the soul becomes ill and can even die altogether. This is something that Jesus tried to explain in the parable of the talents, in the parable of the wedding garment, and, above all, in those two words that one encounters in every instant in the Gospels: watch and pray. Over time I even got used to this very special language of my friend. I introduced him to some of my colleagues, and when they asked me who he was, I didn't know what to answer, so I decided to pass him off as a relative, somewhat eccentric, but a good person at heart. When I reported this to him, secretly hoping that he would tell me the truth about himself, he commented, "Our true relationship is much more real than you imagine it to be. You will find out about this one day. Don't you think you are exaggerating this mystery a bit?" I asked. The truth always seems as an exaggeration to those who do not notice it. It's a bit difficult to take, I do not doubt it. But you still do not realize that we speak different languages, because we have a different understanding. Then, why don't we talk mine? Because even if you don't know it well, you want to learn mine. If I were guided by your words, we would have stopped seeing each other and chatting long ago. I do not speak with what your words make you appear, but with what you can be. This is gibberish. Is this all you have to tell me? What I tell you will always depend on what you want to ask me. Although these interviews always left me uneasy, when I noticed how he always managed my thought and deflected my intentions, I could not prevent my affection for him from increasing. What was happening in me was something very contradictory. This is how time passed. I continued to lean on the boxes of matches that I always carried in my pocket, and I could not forget the war. Above all, I could not forget the feeling of disgust I felt towards myself every time the memory came back to my mind of a certain man who died after I stuck a bayonet in his belly. So horrible was the agony that I had seen him suffer, that for a moment I wished I had been the dead man. These scenes returned frequently now that the war offices were reporting the number of casualties on the different fronts. I could not take these figures as if they were figures only. To me they represented human suffering that did not affect only the troops, but rather each soldier, and each man became the center of a tragedy for a whole family, for a whole circle of friends, and perhaps for the land itself. I could not explain where or how these thoughts came to me, but I felt a great inner discomfort that sometimes turned into something painful. So I was doing my best to get away from them in those moments, and I even got to feel envious of the coldness with which my colleagues mentioned these figures. It also amazed me every time I saw the headlines in the newspapers recording them as if they were events without precedent in the history of the world, and as truly glorious events. The newspapers paid very high sums to have this news. In turn, people gladly paid to read them. The war had become a ghost that haunted my conscience. Out of every 10 messages that came into my hands to be edited, 9 dealt directly with the war and the 10th indirectly. Like this, the time passed in Ethiopia, in Spain, and one day it reached Poland, and finally the war extended throughout the world. So overwhelming was this fact that by the force of their numbers the messages began to cloud me. Little by little I became hardened by so many reproduction of figures on the dead, wounded and missing. One day I realized that I was interested and that I enjoyed the description of the bombing of a city in which thousands and thousands of women, children and the elderly had perished, all of them completely defenseless before the fire that rained down on them from above. And it so happened that that very day I had translated a message containing certain statements made by an important head of the International Red Cross. It was about the 5 points on helping and protecting children, and I had decided to keep a copy for myself. I had left it on my work desk, and when I wanted to find it to take it with me, the other messages about dead, wounded, bombings and naval encounters had covered it completely. I thought for a moment about this apparently accidental fact and realized that just as it had happened with the Red Cross office, so it was happening with my own feelings, and in that instant I remembered the pleading eyes of that boy whom I had hurt with the bayonet, and I thought I saw in them a reproach that said to me, "Have you forgotten so soon?" Each war message repeated this scene in my memory, and along with it the thoughts of hope assailed me. I wanted to believe that the soul of that boy had found some compensation in another life. A fear that was very subtle and powerful began to take hold of me when I realized that I was also becoming hardened. My colleagues used to tease me about these scruples, and some even argued that wars, especially this great war, would bring great scientific progress, so that we could encourage hope for a better world and life. The contradictions of this argument disgusted me. History was the best witness that wars only produce new and bloodier wars. There were these messages indicating to me how the history of this time would be written. Compared with those of the previous war, human cruelty had increased, hatred had intensified. And can a better world be expected from greater cruelty? Or a better life based on a more intense hatred that consumed everything under the legend of total war? In those days I remembered a phrase from Lincoln: "Human progress is in the heart of man." And was I not myself a witness that my own heart was in love with this cruelty and hatred? This singular fear, a cold fear, as if death stalked me in every thought, grew rapidly. When I met my friend again, I shared this with him along with many other reflections that I had made. "Yes," he said, "it is natural. The soul always knows what it wants, and as soon as it starts to awaken, it begins to ask for its own things. There is something in all men that refuses to be deceived by the first explanation that comes to the senses. Some listen to this silent voice, others do not. It is very painful and unpleasant in the beginning. It is the first threshold. When in man there is a beginning of genuine life, the power of everything that takes him to sleep is also fortified. This is a dangerous period because every awakening brings new energy. And everything that is false in our personality takes advantage of this energy and increases our slavery. It can be said without much error that this is how the soul is killed. Thus in the world there are many souls whose life has stopped, and little by little they are losing the possibilities of growth and perfection that are a right that man does not use. There are souls who are definitely dead. The human being is something more than the body and the senses, but he does not know it, he does not understand it. Are you telling me that the soul is not immortal? I asked. That depends on the person, he said, but there are religious principles, Plato's writings, and the claims of many admittedly intelligent men who assure us that we have an immortal soul. You are still sleeping. Are you going to contradict Plato? I could clarify many points for you so that you can understand Plato, but you are not ready yet. I do not understand. You are obsessed with your own ideas, and while you are in such a condition you will not be able to understand anything. Observe a fact. If the soul were a thing that we have naturally assured, the religious writings would not insist on what we should do to save it, nor would there be a need for philosophy or religions. We would know it naturally, and no one would fear death as they fear it. Listen to me. We form the soul in this life based on what moves us. If the motives, the ideals, the ambitions of our life are transitory, things of the immediate moment, our soul will also be transitory, impermanent, subject to what we want. Someday you will be able to serenely reflect on these things and you will understand that boy whose death haunts you. Observe well. You did not kill him of yourself because of yourself you can do nothing. In other words, something that is not yourself, a society, trained you, taught you to kill. Do you remember your exclamation from that day in the church? Well, it is the same. Your exclamation and the bayonet were involuntary. If before launching that exclamation you had been able to realize what you were about to do, you would not have launched it. Same thing with the bayonet. A small reflection and you would not have done it. But in those moments there is no time to reflect. Focus on what I say. There is no time. So in order to act from the heart, it is necessary to overcome time, and this demands a type of will that you do not yet know. Achieving this will require great work, great obedience to something higher. Have you observed and pondered on philanthropy, charity? A man who for years has undergone this training that I am talking about will not be able to avoid doing good. Doing so will for him be a little less than instinctive function. He will do that naturally. But most people think that by doing good they have already achieved what can only be achieved by working intentionally, by going against the current in themselves. As for the immortality of the soul, there is no doubt that it exists, but that it is immortal is a separate story. Try to understand that I am talking about the individual man. Holy Lord! Now I really think you're crazy. I exclaimed, as you like, he said smiling, are you telling me that we are all wrong? Why not? It is not possible, you are very naive. You have the example alive in yourself and despite of it you argue vehemently. But it does not matter. Do you see how wrong it would be for me to be guided solely by your words? You know and feel that war is horrible, that it is a barbaric thing, the culmination of all that is savagery in man. You know that your colleagues are wrong in regards to those casualty figures. For you, on the other hand, each figure is the representation of a human being and that makes you suffer. Those who do not feel what they think will always be wrong. And notice that all this horror is taking place in what we call the Christian world, and one of the main precepts of Christian culture says, "You shall not kill." But man begins to kill in the heart before he actually begins to kill. The death you see everywhere started with hatred, and society justifies it in many ways to silence the voice of conscience, if they ever pay attention to it. Which of the many Christian churches has adopted a vigorous, unequivocal attitude in the face of this war? Only a few isolated men have opposed it and have chosen to sacrifice their lives in laboratory experiments. Let us go back to the interview of the old Nicodemus with Jesus Christ. That interview occurred in times as troubled as today, when one form of culture was collapsing while another was brewing. And Jesus Christ told Nicodemus that it was necessary to be born again, to be born of water and spirit, in order to enjoy the attributes that correspond to a true soul. But many of those who die convinced that their souls will survive. I do not doubt it. The human being is convinced of many things. There was a time when he was convinced that the earth was flat. If you scrutinize the Gospels, you will see that it is very clearly stated in them. What will it be worth for you to win the world if you are going to lose the soul? It was impossible for me to argue with him. My interest in the Holy Scriptures was minimal. I haven't read them nor have I studied them. However, something deep inside told me that my friend was right even when I understood nothing. After a short silence, I said, "Is it not enough then to comply with what religion commands? To comply faithfully and from the heart the ordinary precepts of religion is the first step, an indispensable step. Everything is linked, everything is united. The religious forms are the external appearance of what can be called the inner church. And this one is immortal indeed. That is what the Creed refers to when it speaks of the communion of saints. So I took the opportunity to ask him to explain the true way of praying. You have been praying very intensely, but without realizing it. I responded by telling him about my experiences from when I was a student. You see, he said, ignorance was about to blind you completely. And now you are the one who denies the food that your soul needs. Do not think that now you will be able to blame your teachers, your confessors, or your parents. You could have done it until recently, now that is forbidden to you. If you are interested in learning more about the Lord's Prayer, for example, begin to unravel what it really means to forgive our debtors. I tell you these things because sincere ignorance is forgivable, but not hypocrisy, or our lying, or our laziness. And how will I do that? In the same way you have done the rest. For example, that verse that says deliver us from all evil, you have lived in your own way. And living a plea is more important than formulating it. You went to church to ask for more intelligence, as you have told me. Intelligence is precisely an attribute of the kingdom of heaven. You were given some understanding. The other verse, let us not fall into temptation, you have experienced in the horror you lived because of the fact that you were turning numb inside. But this is a very strange way to pray, I said in astonishment. It is the only way of the heart. To understand the prayers, it is necessary to have an idea, even an approximate one, of the communion of saints. Each of the prayers that we know is a concise treatise of knowledge of great importance. It is psychology that ordinary psychologists ignore. The Our Father, for example, can be for an individual a Jacob's ladder with which to reach heaven, if the individual lives it. For a physicist it can be the means of explaining the nature of the universe. And I know a man dedicated to astronomy who has understood it for the benefit of his studies. These prayers are the work of the communion of saints. Now, the communion of saints has many names, depending on the creed that each race practices. It is not an established organization, but a bead of universal life. They are the guardians of culture and civilization, the helpers of God. You often tell me about the food of the soul. What are you referring to? I am referring to a food that is as real as what the body needs. This is clear from the words of Jesus. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word of God. Physical food contains energies that nourish the soul. It is necessary for growth. And by growth I mean inner growth. When man eats, drinks, and breathes with the fixed purpose of nourishing his soul, he extracts from food, air, and drink certain substances that are especially nutritious. But there is a food superior to this, and it is the one that impresses us intimately. We all know that irritation hinders digestion. An irritation is an impression. Liver disorders produce a sour character. So by feeding properly on impressions, whether internal or external, we can nourish ourselves better or worse. But this requires studies and efforts. For example, there are those who pray before eating, invoking the blessing of the Most High, but during the meal they chat, discuss, or have arguments. During the digestive process there are those who even cast curses. In other words, they do not have a continuity of purpose. Through continuity of purpose, a new organ is formed in man. But this organ must potentially exist and be able to grow. What organ is that? Now you wouldn't understand it because you are convinced you already have it. Everyone is convinced of the same thing, as they are convinced of the continuity of their purpose. I will only tell you that it is formed in one way and not in two. Voluntary suffering and striving to follow the voice of the consciousness, but everyone suffers. No, sufferings come to them as pleasures come to them. Voluntary suffering presupposes a certain degree of will. One's own will. We all know that hate is bad and that love is good. We know that we must love our enemies. We know these things by heart, but we cannot apply them because we simply do not have enough will to put it into practice. So the society we live in compromises with what it calls human weakness and forgets the principle. To be able to suffer voluntarily, it is necessary to have the strength to overcome accidental suffering. And this does not mean fleeing to pleasures, because whoever suffers accidentally also enjoys accidentally. It is necessary to overcome the accidental. And this is only possible through a continuity of purpose, on a clear understanding of many things, most of which the modern education ignores or despises. Rarely have we had such a long talk. I would have liked to continue, but he soon changed the topic of the conversation and we planned new bicycle rides. A long time passed before we returned to these issues. During that time I wanted to understand his words and I often checked my notes, but I didn't understand much. The few times we touched the subject, he avoided delving into it and, for my part, I stopped making the annotations so that now it would be impossible for me to reconstruct the loose sentences and the explanations that he gave me on many points. I was especially interested in the food of the soul, but he insisted that it was first necessary to wake up. What do you mean by waking up? I asked him one day. You still don't realize it. The awakening or wakefulness of which I speak is difficult, but not impossible. It is a continuous effort, a permanent walk of blindness for a long time until we understand our fallacies. But the great moment arrives for those who keep the effort alive. Then the latent possibilities in man are noticed. It is something that one knows, without needing to be told about it or to have it interpreted by anyone. Different kinds of lives, different levels, are discovered in the body. Then one no longer walks blind. He knows where he is going and he knows why he is doing everything that he is doing. The Gospels become a very valuable guide. You see, neither you nor I can say that we are disciples of such a magnificent and glorious being as Jesus Christ, and we believe we are awake. In the Garden of Gethsemane the apostles, the disciples, fell asleep. My friend said these last words with such a reverent tone that he impressed me. His eyes began to fill with tears and he let them run down his cheeks without being ashamed of it. What follows, he said in a voice broken by an emotion so powerful that, for an instant, it shook me too. I was perplexed. He went on to say, an apostle is himself a superior man and Jesus was of an intelligence rarely seen on earth. However, there are those who think that he surrounded himself with idiots and fools. The apostles had a strong will, otherwise they would not have been able to live close to Jesus. However, they all failed him in his last days. And that is the story of the inner growth of man. Ups and downs. We were both silent. I did not want to continue questioning him for fear of causing further disturbances. He noticed my attitude and said, "Don't misinterpret this emotion, it is not weakness, it is strength. It is the way to obtain a unique understanding." My attention was powerfully caught by his reference to the intelligence of Jesus and his disciples. For some reason I thought that Judas must have been the same as the others, and I told him so. First of all, he said, I must insist on a fact. To be a disciple of a figure like Jesus Christ, it is necessary to have seen something, to have understood something. It is necessary to know something truly real. Now, the disciples are said to have been fishermen. Jesus tells them that he will make them fishers of men. This means that the 12 disciples already had some spiritual preparation when they made contact with the Master. If they had not known something truly real, they would not have been able to recognize the Christ in Jesus. They would not have been able to properly value his teaching. Getting close to Christ already presupposes an intelligence of a certain development, a certain degree of will, and a more or less profound feeling for the truth. Naturally, after the crucifixion everything changed, but this is something else. Secondly, to suppose that Judas was able to deceive Jesus is almost a blasphemy. The relationship between Christ and his disciples is a relationship that cannot be conceived by man in terms of an ordinary life based on the understanding brought by the senses. It is necessary to go beyond the senses. That is, to form eyes to see and ears to hear. To see and hear meanings rather than isolated facts, is to see and to hear in a plane of relationship. It is said that Judas betrayed Jesus, but when the meaning of the events is grasped, it is soon realized that Judas' conduct was not the work of his own will. He was obliged to sell Jesus. What selling means in evangelical language is related to poverty or wealth in spirit. Just remember that the kingdom of heaven is said to be something very precious that a good merchant finds, and that he immediately sells everything he has to be able to acquire that preciousness. Reverse the process to get closer to an understanding. The mystery of Judas is one of the mysteries that most confuse us. Jesus knew that he was going to die. What's more, he knew how he was going to die. His death was already predetermined, so there was no room for betrayal, because any betrayal requires the element of trust based on ignorance. Think about it a little. Because Jesus insists that he chose the 12 and that one of them was the devil. Looking back at the facts, it is very easy to judge and condemn Judas based on what others interpret. But unraveling the mystery for oneself, led only by the thirst to know the truth, is something else. We all have a Judas within us, as we have a Baptist, a Peter, a John, and almost all the characters that appear in the Gospels. If it is understood that these writings deal mainly with the inner development of men, one begins to see in himself the legion of characters, as well as the facts and events that connect them. Another point that interested me was about love and sexual relationships. When I approached this matter a few days after the previous case, he told me, "Love is the key to everything, because it is the force that preserves and maintains everything." The formula to love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself requires a very deep consideration. No one can love his neighbor more than himself, but to love oneself requires a certain type of impressions that are a bit difficult to explain. If we see and consider love from the point of view of impressions, we will see that those who are in love see it all rosy. That is a very special nourishment. But when one loves knowingly, consciously, with full knowledge and with full understanding, the delights of the person in love are nothing compared with the delights of love that sprouts only from the Spirit. To love oneself well is to yearn for inner growth, and this requires normality. Someone who suffers from an inhibition or frustration cannot love himself. So loving oneself necessarily implies the normal balance of all functions, including sexual. But this is difficult to understand unless the adultery in love is understood. Adultery in love, from this point of view, is having a loving or sexual relationship with someone whom one doesn't fully love, and the love must be mutual. Only conscious love can produce true love. There is a very big difference between loving and being in love. The former presupposes self-knowledge to a certain extent and understanding of certain laws, while the latter is a thing predetermined by the life of nature for the purposes of the creation and maintenance of life. For a conscious evolution, balance and normality are necessary. This is determined by your own understanding. In addressing this issue, the Gospels use the expression unak. But before indicating this, it is indicated that the order comes from the interior word. And this is comprehension. A few days later, my friend gave me a writing, a poem, whose contrast with the aridity of his explanatory words, which I have quoted, caught my attention. The poem goes like this. God gave the sun the earth as a wife and blessed that love when he created the moon. In this way he also created you, woman, to pour his life into human love. And so that in the pleasure of loving the soul finds the path of return to where it always is today, where there is no change. Because just as life goes to death for love, so love rises from death where there is an awakened heart that knows how to hold it in his loving and his dying. With each kiss the soul dies a little when forgetting that it is life in love. And, for the same reason, with each kiss can revive the soul of someone who knows how to die. O paradox of creation! In each breath of love there is a sigh that is eternity. And in each caress the fire of death and resurrection also burns. Raise the simple and plain love to the highest summits. So that loving and kissing are a prayer of life to the most intimate being who is the truth and is God, because it is not you who loves, but the love of the Father that shakes within you. Yours will be his most powerful blessing if in each kiss you give and receive you sanctify his name, keeping his presence in your most intimate longings. And in your love, seek also first the kingdom of God and its justice, so that everything else, even the happiness of being, will be given to you in addition. And do not be afraid to love, rather fear those who can turn your love into prejudice or evil. Make of your union a serene path to heaven. As long as you carry his presence in your hearts, you will truly be loving God above all else while loving one another. And in the instant of your supreme bliss, you will be one with him and with his creation. I did not see him again for some time, for he must have made a long journey. We exchanged some postcards. I remember that in one of them I asked him what one could do to achieve such an understanding of life and love. His answer came in the form of this paradoxical poetry. Do not doubt the doubt, and doubt. But doubt with faith, and even doubt of the faith. For isn't the doubt inertia on the slope of faith towards darkness, and strengthen the impulse to reach comprehension? Don't doubt, and yet doubt of everything you believe is true because the doubt is also true, in itself and for itself. Doubting of the doubt, and doubting with faith and of the faith, you will see the illusion of the doubt and the faith collapse at your feet, and rising majestically before your eyes the doubt made truth. We started meeting again at the beginning of the following autumn. I noticed certain changes in him, but could not explain them. He avoided topics related to the Gospels. Only once, when I told him that I could not understand how he was so devoted to Jesus Christ and at the same time so keen on reading Mayan, Incan, Guarani, Hindu and Chinese works, did he made the following observation. Each people, each race, each nation, each age, has had messengers who have borne witness to the same and unique truth even when they have used different words, different symbols, and different allegories. Words, symbols and allegories do not have a permanent value in themselves, they are only means that must be discarded little by little as the understanding and experience of reality grow. But for a long time in our lives we cannot but see words in words and symbols in symbols. When we realize that two symbols are not the same, we care little to find out whether or not we are right. We have long believed that external differences have the same internal difference. But each symbol is a word and each word is a symbol. How many people truly know what they are saying when they say I? This explanation was followed by something about the dimensions of time and the dimensions of space. As I have indicated, I wrote down most of the things he said. But this time I did not do it, and I vaguely remember something along the lines that space is time, that there are 3 dimensions of space and 3 dimensions of time, that the Hebrew symbol of the 6-pointed star was an indicative symbol that space and time were one sole thing or being. If I remember correctly, on one occasion he also said that the words of Jesus, I am the way, the truth and the life, could be taken in physics as the 3 dimensions of time in addition to constituting a process of cosmic order that together with 5 other processes that are based in the Trinity constituted all the universal processes, in all degrees of being. But, as I have already said, on this I have no notes of his words, although I gather that there are writings about it somewhere. Many other things he told me went in trough one ear and out through the other. At that time I was interested in many other things apart from my friendship with him. But our friendship held firm. He was not a showy man. He dressed well, but not luxurious. With a bit more dressing he would have been an elegant man. For some reason he was trying to dress very discreetly and seemed not to want to attract attention, but, as I saw things, he attracted it even when he did not want to. Many times I wanted to ponder upon the things he said. I envied his calmness, his serenity. Me, on the other hand, was a powder keg one day and a sea of tenderness the next. When I suffered some setback, I couldn't help but to remember his words. We both kept visiting the same church every afternoon. But as a result of the war, my life began to change rapidly, and time has started to shorten up. From quick and increasingly scattered visits to the church, I first went to several days of absence, which then became weeks, and I suddenly realized that I had already stopped praying and that I had also stopped having those talks with my friend whom I only saw when he, without prior notice, showed up at my office. My situation had improved a lot. I was a prosperous man. I had an important position, and like all important men, I lacked time for many things, such as, for example, to fulfill the promise that I myself had made not to miss a day at the temple. I justified myself by blaming the war. My importance was in the fact that everyone was interested in being promptly informed about the events. Diplomats and politicians knew that they would always find the breaking news on my table. My phone was continuously ringing. It was necessary to install another one with private number. Every day I was visited or called by government officials, embassies, large commercial firms, etc. And naturally, these professional contacts soon became personal friendships. My circle became bigger. The inevitable invitations to parties, honorary wines, and intimate gatherings organized by one group or another began to arrive. And I, who could not find time to go to church for half an hour in the afternoons, have found that I could attend all those social functions. Indeed, I always resorted to the excuse, "It's about the war and I owe to the public that pays for my services." When one day I gave an explanation of a similar type to my friend, he looked at me with the compassionate expression, and taking a blank page from my table, he wrote, "Never feel so perfect that you let your guard down or lighten your vigilance. Love yourself well, but don't prostitute yourself, keep it where you can see it often," he told me as he handed it to me. Then he stood up and left. Several months have passed without seeing him. I often remembered him. His strange observations, his timely advice on problems for which I thought he was completely ignorant of, all this and my own conscience gave me a strange uneasiness every time I thought of him and read his words. Around that time, the good neighborhood frenzy began, the Pan-American frenzy. International intrigues, each more mean, flourished everywhere. I was able to realize that various European powers, supposedly friends of the United States, were covertly fighting the idea of good neighborhood. They all wanted to get a slice of the profit produced by the good deals of war. Neither industrialists, nor miners, nor politicians, diplomats or journalists, were free from this temptation. And I also fell into it, gladly, through a friend who speculated heavily on the stock market and who needed to be well informed and timely about the events of the war. This is how I started becoming rich. On the other hand, certain organizations of propaganda began to ask me for contributions in the form of articles. And they paid for them all the better the more high-sounding and stupid they were. I accepted and made more money. At one point I remembered some observations my friend had made when the first polls began about the good neighborhood of the United States. Good neighbor can only be the one who pays cash. Nowadays no one is in a position to do so, much less the South American countries. But since man lives off nice-sounding words, and the nicer they sound the more stupid they are, they find that the concept is sonorous, they applaud it and they don't know what they are getting into. It is a concept born from the parable of the Good Samaritan. But in the United States someone has distorted it and other countries have distorted it even more. But the idea is nice, and as in the United States there are dollars in abundance, there goes the Pan-American troop that is nothing but a snake with 20 mouths and one head. This is too caustic, I told him. The truth is always caustic, especially for the hypocrites. Do not identify so much with the propaganda you write, and perhaps you will be able to see something of reality, but the good neighborhood at least means good intention. Satan has the best intentions with man, that's why he makes a fool of him. You see everything so coldly. Pan-Americanism is a good intention. You are still sleeping. If you understood that man cannot have continuity in his purpose, you would soon understand that intention is not enough. If man could maintain a continuity in his thought, feeling and action, his good intentions would bear generous fruit. Just as an individual has very good intentions one day, and the next anything deviates him from them, so it is also in politics. The democratic idea is older than walking, but it is impossible because it requires discrimination that few have. Among my notes from that time I found a page from a letter that he wrote to me during one of his trips, regarding the international politics of back then. It goes like this. Mr. Roosevelt is undoubtedly a very well-intentioned man, but it happens that the only good neighbor he has is his cigarette. Just as Mr. Churchill's only true ally is his cigar, and Mr. Stalin's only comrade is his pipe. Note that neither Hitler nor Mussolini smoke. They are too virtuous, and like any fanatic of virtue, they only see the straw in someone else's eye. When this war is over, there will probably be another, and with it perhaps science will progress to the extreme of getting the pleasure and enjoying the glory of having destroyed civilization. Nothing is easier than prophesying a war. But war also includes uneasiness in the life of nations and of the individual himself. If this inner uneasiness was used by the individual for his development, and if he tried to find out where it comes from and why it occurs, I believe that a step towards peace would be taken. But it is not an easy thing to get man to understand that in the face of celestial phenomena he is less than an atom. Peace is an individual conquest. It has never been the work of the masses, and much less the work of armies. Man has not yet learned to take advantage of what history teaches, what experience indicates. The League of Nations was for many years an illusion of peace. The truth is that it was a source of intrigue. Mussolini destroyed it in one stroke. After this war, something similar may arise, but with some other name. Man enjoys naming or renaming the oldest things in history. The League of Nations was born dead. It already died in Greece more than 2,000 years ago, with the Amphictyonian. It is not about organizations. It is not necessary to change names, but it is necessary to change man. Don't ask me to take the good neighborhood seriously because it all adds up to a bunch of lies. The tragedy is that no one intentionally lies, no one realizes the great lie. Observe it in yourself, observe how you have already begun to believe in all the lies you are writing. Of all this, what interested me was the idea that a good neighbor can only be the one who pays cash. I decided to use the idea for an article, and when I published it, my life suffered a new transformation connected, in a way, with this unique friend. I was thrown into the intrigues of political espionage. Within days of crafting this idea into a series of articles, I came into contact with certain vendors of machinery that could not be manufactured anywhere else. I met them through some diplomatic friends. And since then my importance increased. Suddenly I saw that even my opinions were important. Even the biggest nonsense that I used to say, when I had a little more alcohol in my body, began to have importance. The importance and consideration they attached to me did not lie in my intelligence or critical judgment, since I had not used either of these two functions for a long time. It was based simply on the position that I held and that I would continue to perform as long as I complied with the emptiness of my importance. It is not worth telling my story in the midst of all the intrigues of that time. I only cite the facts that are related to my friend and his ideas. But what I was able to observe in the politicians, diplomats and spies with whom I was in contact with would be a good material for a wonderful humorous comedy were it not for the tragic consequences that the activity of this fauna and flora of our culture brought about. I observe that I am writing with a certain resentment, and I do not hide it. And if my friend could read this now, he would surely say something like this. You haven't learned to forgive. You still sleep. Your flora and fauna cannot stop or mutilate life. As I write this, I realize how nostalgic I feel for him, how sorry I am not to be by his side now. But let's get back to the story. One night he invited me to have dinner with him. My confidence had not waned. We chatted at length and with great joy. I told him my observations and he smiled affectionately and understandingly, as if to mean, the poor little ones are not to blame. After dinner we went together to my apartment, which was in stark contrast to that simple room in which I had lived for so many years before becoming important. He looked at everything in silence. Looking back on that night, I see how dull my behavior was. I started by proudly showing him all my possessions, the titles of the stock market shares, the clothes, a nice miniature bar, my sports corner with its sandbag, the punching ball, the boxing gloves and the iron crowbars, and my beautiful Italian bicycle. When I had finished my exhibition, I said to him in a proud tone, "What do you think?" "Perfect," he said. "You have little to go to be a complete moron." I am not referring to this to comfort, but to your attitude towards all this well-being and the damage that you are doing to yourself. "I don't understand you," I said. "I earn a lot of money, I live well and I enjoy life. Listen," I said, "you are more intelligent than me. I'll give you half of everything I have and everything I earn if you help me get out of this." He looked at me silently, not saying a single word. I realized too late how I had hurt him. I saw how tears came into his eyes. He walked away overwhelmed by a singular sadness, and when he was already at the door, he said, 30 coins of silver." I wanted to ask him to forgive me, but something held me back. I approached the bar, and while I was serving myself a glass of whiskey, I remembered that other silent scene that seemed to have happened in a too distant past, when in the church I had exclaimed "shit" and he answered "amen." I drank the whiskey in one go, looked at the stimulant tablets he had left on the bar counter, and said out loud, "He can go to hell." I drank whiskey until I was drunk. Time went by. Suddenly, the machine I was in began to function in a different way, more intensely. We were nearing the end of the war. Everything was more desperate. I changed cities, I went to another country, and there I had to continue what I had started and from what I could no longer escape. I only remembered my friend from time to time. Every day I was amazed at how easily I lied and cheated, and how easily everyone seemed to believe my lies and deceptions. One night when I was drinking more than necessary to forget my dirtiness, I found my friend. He looked at me in silence, and without giving me time to express my joy, he told me, "Reflect a bit. Do not look for sufferings that you do not need." I knew I couldn't lie to him. I asked him not to leave me, and he told me that he was going to stay in that city for a while and that we would probably see each other often. We talked very little that night. It did not cease to intrigue me that I was looking for sufferings that I did not need. But, as usual, I thought it would be a new extravagance on his behalf. Instead, I would very much have liked to have shown him more hospitality and generally reciprocate his devotion in a more tangible way. When I offered him accommodation in my house, he politely declined, informing me that his trip had been arranged by other friends and that he had already promised to stay with them, but that we would see each other often. In our next interview, I asked him if he had read my chronicles, and he answered that he did, and that he had cut out some of them to keep. This caught my attention powerfully. I was waiting for him to tell me something like, "I don't read political propaganda, etc." But the fact that he had cut out one of my chronicles was certainly something new. I asked him which chronicle it was. He took it out of his wallet. I was hoping that it would be one of those speculations full of complexities aimed to present an international picture, citing the magnates of the banks and union leaders, etc. But what my friend had cut out was something very different. A comment on certain Guarani songs that consisted of my own impressions. "It is very interesting what you have observed in this music," he said. "It faithfully corresponds to a treasure of wisdom that the Guarani still feel but no longer understand, overwhelmed by the Western culture. In it I see the same as in all the folklore of the continent, a thread hidden in time. Read this Yucatecan work and you will see the same content, although in a different form." And he gave me a little book that I still have. He told me that this chronicle was what had prompted him to seek me again, and he added, "You can't imagine the good you did to yourself by listening to that music with such attention. It will always vibrate within you." I smiled rather smugly, and in turn replied, "Man, if you want Guarani music, I have it in abundance at home. I also have 2 beautiful Mayan songs, and abundance of records of the music of the Incas." I related to him in detail how I had put together this collection and even mentioned how much I paid for it. He listened to me with pleasure. The Guarani have a very rich expression that means that everything that man says in words, in human language, is a portion of the substance of the soul. You will notice that this concept is similar to one of the holy truths of Christianity when it affirms that the mouth speaks out of the richness of the heart. And there are those who have also said that man can only express what he is. Anyway, the next night we had dinner at my house and we didn't get tired of listening to the Guarani music. But I was agitated and nervous due to the events of the day and would have preferred to discuss my personal problems with him. He listened to the music with delight. I drank whiskey. The music was certainly attractive, but my head was full of many worries as a result of my life in the midst of so much intrigue. My situation was already becoming too dense, and it seemed that I did not have a single crack through which to flee. In that instant I envied how relaxed my friend was, the incalculable peace that was in him, and, above all, his security, his poise. When he got to his feet, shortly before leaving, he said to me, "The Guarani have done more or less the same thing that you are doing with that glass of whiskey. They drink coffee. It is not entirely unpleasant, but to drink it to escape from oneself is the most foolish thing a man can do. The Guarani have fallen into the same web of sleepiness that you have fallen into. That music we just heard is the voice of their soul captured by a man who still wants to wake up his own people. The voice of life still vibrates in them, but they have allowed themselves to be hypnotized not only by alcohol but by the Western encyclopedism that is the poison that consumes our peoples. I don't think anything has died in the Guarani," I told him. "Their manhood is pretty clear. I believe that the Guarani is the bravest man I have ever known. I saw it in the war. And by the way, it was during the war that I got to know his music, and I found it as beautiful and elegant as the Andean music. Yes, both are genuine calling of the soul of these lands, but the forms are different because they correspond to different latitudes. Both are essentially mystical music. The one of Inca origin follows the rhythm of the movement of the heavenly bodies, and it cannot be otherwise. It is music that encompasses, in its beat and in its melody, all that our soul already knows about the solar system and the unknowns of the Milky Way and the Pleiades. At more than 3,000 meters above sea level, with a starry sky above all the landscape, it is certain that the man of the Andes feels in grandiose terms. If his thought were on the same level as his feeling, the race would not have degenerated. This degeneration began long before the conquest. Even so, its degeneration is proportionally less than the Occidental one in relation to Christianity. This can be seen in the writings that survived the Catholicization of the empire. The soul of these races still retains sufficient spiritual strength, but unfortunately, they do not know how to bring it up to date and have hid it in the depths of the Catholic practices. As for the Guarani, the semi-tropical nature in which they live gave them another rhythm, another form, another feeling, but in essence it says the same about spirituality. It happens that very few men understand the reality of life through feelings, emotions, and that has produced a civilization of schizophrenics. What has been called the subconscious are but correlative functions that can operate harmoniously with the mind, with thought. That is why I tell you that if all this artistic treasure, if this emotional expression were understood intellectually, the races of our continent would understand their true destiny. Yes, both are, but there are already those who are working to give light in this regard. For the moment these men are like John the Baptist, a voice crying out in the wilderness. From what you tell me, it would seem convenient to revive the religions and myths of the indigenous races. I said, no, that would be foolish. In that sense, nothing has to be revived because nothing has died. We cannot go back to the forms of the past, we can only understand the eternal principle that animates all forms. We have to understand, and not disperse or divide. And this is a task for each individual. It is estimated that in South America there are 10 million Indians. A daring man who knows their languages could organize and revolt them. It would be interesting. He looked at me compassionately. You see, he said, there, in yourself, you have the Occidental schizophrenia. You have become saturated with violence to such extreme that you cannot measure life except in terms of destruction and death. Several days passed without us meeting again. By that time the issues of my life were getting complicated in an unbelievable way. The machine trapped me relentlessly and I felt like a little bird mesmerized by a snake, knowing that it is going to die, knowing that it has to flee but not being able to. When I saw my friend again, I confided the facts to him. It is too late now, he told me. Now you have to follow the movement of the machine as far as it takes you. You cannot run away. Look. And leading me to a window facing the street, he pointed out two men that were trying to hide their presence. Who are they? I asked. You are so proud of your success that you haven't realized things. The lie has you trapped. They are policemen who have been following you for several days. I felt a blow in my heart. I am not intimidated easily, and although I know fear, I also know that courage is precisely to dominate it no matter how intensely it haunts us. But something in me trembled in horror at the harsh fact that it was coming to an end. I looked at my friend, waiting for him to say something, but he only commented, "You should be deeply grateful to have this exit presented to you. Usually for the type of intrigue that you have embarked on, the way out is suicide or an accident in the street." He made no further comment. He knew me well enough to know that I was not going to kill myself. And as for the accident in the street, I was left cold. I knew well that I was a danger to many and that many would welcome my disappearance. But I had anticipated this possibility and had let them all know that I kept a diary in which I had noted things that the political and diplomatic world calls very interesting. There were several copies of that diary, some of them abroad and others in a bank. I told my friend these things. "A cornered rat always has a talent," he said. I turned toward him violently and had my fist raised to hit him, but his gaze paralyzed me. Even now I cannot explain to myself how that occurred. He didn't lift a finger, didn't make a single gesture. He only looked at me and I was disarmed both inside and out. "You are so rotten that you have lost your strength," he said. "How you have changed. Once you revealed to me the way you pray in church. Remember that, foolish and childish as those words may have been, at least your integrity and honesty were of value. Now look at yourself." The remembrance of those days so remote in my memory, seeing them rising before me in that situation, in those conditions, shook me. Unable to avoid it, I began to cry like a child. In that moment I realized how much I loved my friend, how much he meant to me. He moved away to another room while I continued crying in a corner. When I recovered, I went to look for him and found him on his knees, with his arms in the shape of a cross and looking towards the sky through the open window. Without showing the slightest hurry, he stood up and, looking at me, he said, "Crying is a good purgative, it purifies the blood." He went to the bathroom and I saw him wash his face with cold water. He, too, had cried. During that winter the situation in the country became exceedingly rough. I was too closely tied to the war. But it was in spring that events took on bloody proportions and a number of things happened that led to me finally being arrested by the police and taken to jail. It would be convenient to record some of the observations made by my friend that are related to the events of that time, despite the fact that he affirmed that none of the things that happened were new. I had clearly realized the growing strength that the presumed dictator of that country was gaining. He was making a comedy to exploit the sentiments of the masses that followed him blindly by the virtue of a few circumstantial benefits that they had received. My chronicles highlighted these events, but my bosses protested and accused me of being a supporter of the man. There was violence. They wanted a more active opposition in my writing, and they did not seem able to understand the need to tell the truth and face the obvious reality that we were witnessing. When I told about these facts to my friend, he said, "The only thing that really matters in all this entanglement is that the feathered serpent wants to fly already, but its legs are shackled to the ground. Please don't answer me with riddles. There is no riddle in this. If instead of wasting your time in childishness you had taken the thread of some indications that I have given you from time to time, you would have studied something transcendental, and you would understand the enormous significance that the feathered serpent has for you. For this is all very good," I told him, "but it does not explain the reason why my bosses are so obtuse that they do not want to see the reality of the situation in this country. They are serpents without wings and without feathers. Surely you could tell me things more clearly. I don't want to make it clearer to you. The truth is always bitter for the sleeping man, because it brings him out of his drowsiness. You've been telling me the same thing for years and I still don't understand, because you still sleep." As that winter progressed, my chronicles began to attract various characters from other countries. The general situation seemed uncertain. Other countries received contradictory information. But an event on which I reported in detail determined a new form of relations with politicians and diplomats who came in search of correct reports. The event was that the presumed dictator, on the wise advice of his chief of police, raided every prominent opponent, including doctors, publishers of large newspapers, internationally renowned lawyers, etc., all of whom were leading the movement of freedom of thought and other types of freedom that my friend described, summarizing them as the freedom of dreaming awake. Regarding the political leaders, my friend said that it was about a collection of Pontius Pilates that couldn't be anything else except in cases when in human comedy they changed roles and were Herod who, more than once, had been obliged to please the vanities of different types of Salome, and slaughter more than one honest Baptist. The facts more than sufficiently confirmed my friend's words. But in order to balance the situation, I will quote my friend's opinion about the dictator and his people. "Those are the ones who sleep the most and the best," he said. "They dream that they dominate the masses and do not have enough insight to notice that they are crying out Hosanna with the same ease with which they shout crucify him, but it is by all known how the end of the war confirmed all this. The fact was that the Democratic leaders waited patiently in jail for the masses to come out to rescue them, but no one lifted a finger in their favor. Rather, all applauded the dictator full of euphoria for having dared to touch the untouchables. This event disturbed the political and diplomatic understanding of everyone. It was obvious that this dictator, as almost all of them, intuitively knew the passions of the masses and exploited them well. The opposition was destroyed. But even like this, few realized the truth. There were many editorials, many protests, but it was uproar and no more than uproar. My chronicles, which to some extent reflected the views of my friend, began to attract attention and attracted the men who I already indicated. One day one came and I informed him in detail. This confidential envoy, however, sent his government a report of several pages to conclude, saying that it was convenient to postpone a decision, that everything was still uncertain. When he returned 2 months later, he again informed his people that there was still a need to postpone any decision. This irritated me. "Why are you deceiving your government?" I said. The man was neither upset nor offended. He looked at me very pleased and said, "I also see the situation as you see it. But it happens that we are also on the eve of elections and our situation has not yet been clarified, and I still do not know what position I am going to adopt. The so-and-so," and he cited the name of a governor, "has no sympathy for so-and-so, the name of the dictator, and has, instead, a good chance of being the next president in my country. As he occupies a prominent position, I sent him a copy of the report so that as the presumed governor he is aware of the facts. A final report, such as your chronicles, would only serve to make him forget my services. On the other hand, with various reports I prepare the possibility of getting assigned the embassy of this country. You, my friend, would be a lousy diplomat." This was one case. There were others. The one directly opposite to the previous case was that of the envoy from a country whose situation was similar to the one I was observing. He hurried to make contact with the dictator's men, did not hide his sympathy for him, and offered to buy from me all the material that I had accumulated. Like a sponge he absorbed everything I told him. And based on that he issued a report, of which he provided me with the copy. It was filled with the most fantastic claims that I have read in my entire career. I myself have shamelessly lied to please my readers, but the report of this diplomat surpassed all fantasy and reality together. It seemed like a tale from 1001 Nights. He then made me a series of commercial propositions. It was not the first time that I met with people who were hiding the facts in order to speculate with them. "Do you think someone in your government will believe this?" I said. "Don't worry about it, pal," he responded. He was a nice man, pleasant, shameless to satiation, but I could not condemn him. We were both trapped in a machine. My astonishment was great when I realized that his government had accepted his report and was acting on his basis. I could never explain to myself how men who seem to be skilled in the affairs of state can have their gullets as open as any other knave. This confidential envoy, before returning to his homeland, gave me a very thin wallet full of bills, and when I weakly wanted to reject it, he told me, "By no means, dear friend. You helped me with the magnificent business." Later I learned that the business was a heavy smuggling of very scarce raw materials for the industry due to the war. I related all these facts to my friend. "That's the oldest trick in the world," he said. "They are not guilty. They are irresponsible. But you worry about not shackling the feathered serpent. Remember that you cannot serve two masters." Again I ignored his prudent advice. Events were picking up speed. The police watched me more and more closely, and in the hope of saving myself in some way I began to participate in many conspiracies against the dictator. In the middle of spring, with good weather, a wave of violence was unleashed everywhere, throughout the country. The students began to riot, spurred on by the democratic heroes that the police had humiliated. These would release one manifest after another, written comfortably in an elegant club. One day I had to meet with them, as a result of certain events in which several students had been arrested and wounded. I informed them of the facts. That awful They exclaimed, "Where is this man going to lead us?" "You know perfectly well," I told them. "You should act now, but what can we do? If you are afraid of going to the streets to confront the thugs and police, at least don't incite those boys anymore. It is because love for the country burns in their blood," said a banker. "Screw you, bastards!" I exclaimed with all the fury that consumed me those days. I went home and my friend was waiting for me. I told him about the incident. "The feathered serpent wants to fly," was his entire reply. I was not in the mood for these things. I turned my back on him and went to my room. When I had calmed down, I found him going through the notebook in which I wrote down his comments and observations. He was correcting some things. "You are a good journalist and you have a good memory," he told me. "You have made few mistakes." What to do? I asked him. "Recuperate your manhood. Either give yourself openly and tell the whole truth, or continue until the end, and whatever may come will come." "I will go on until the end," I said, with the hope that something would happen to my advantage. I was beginning to feel a certain disgust towards myself, and I entrusted this to my friend. "It is natural," he said. "The dream turns into a nightmare because the effect of the psychic drugs that you have been taking all this time is already wearing off. But do not despair. Someday you will discover the enormous secret of confession and its value, and then you will know that the feathered serpent can fly." It was in those days that I discovered that my friend was a consummate actor, that he could modify his appearance almost at will, and that he could transform himself into whoever he wished. The incident that led to this new discovery began one night when politicians with whom I was in close contact in the conspiracy called me with great urgency. We arranged a meeting far from the city center. When I left my house, agitated by the urgent tone with which they had called me, I encountered my friend. "Something's wrong. So-and-so called me." "Come with me," I told him. The problem was that one of the conspirators, director of a newspaper of battle and who had a rather notable circulation at the time, had received a confidential warning. That same night they were going to arrest and imprison him. He did not doubt of the truthfulness of that warning. It had been given to him by a policeman who was going to take an active part in the event. This policeman owed the director certain favors and was also being paid by the conspiracy group. The problem was in helping the director to escape, and we thought that his escape could be used for propaganda purposes. The immediate thing was, however, to make him disappear before the police captured him. We were discussing various plans when my friend intervened. "You can appeal to the right of asylum," he said. It was a valuable indication. I ran to the phone and called a diplomatic friend. I was about to tell him our plan when my friend covered my mouth with his hand and warned me. "Tell him to go immediately to his embassy, and to leave the door open because you will be arriving by car." So I did. This diplomat was one of those who had benefited with my things, so he readily agreed. The director, my friend, and I left the meeting. We took a taxi, and when I was about to give the address of the embassy, my friend gave a completely opposite address. We traveled for half an hour in silence. We stopped at a late-night bakery. It was only when we were seated at a table that I realized the reason for my friend's precautions. The police had followed us. They were two agents who couldn't hide their identity. I saw one of them phoning. My friend saw it too and said, "They do not dare to act alone. They are calling for help. Now we will use a very old trick." Saying this, he stood up and went to bathroom. We followed him. Inside, he exchanged clothes with the director. They were both of more or less the same shape. We then made a deliberately suspicious exit, one by one, as the police officers watched us. The three of us met at the corner and saw the two officers approach us with an awful concealment. When they were relatively close, my friend started a comedy in such a natural way that I almost fell on my back. He made a spectacular farewell, making an appointment to meet us the next day in such place and such hour. I was perplexed. My friend had perfectly imitated the voice and accent of the director of the newspaper. He even walked the same like him. He approached the sidewalk, called a taxi, and left. In a few minutes we saw how the agents went after him. The director of the newspaper and I were astonished. He said, "Very noble is the gesture of your friend. Who is he?" I did not answer him. Watching the police go after him, I was overcome by a very singular fear. He was very well informed about police methods to ignore the fate that awaited him if they managed to catch him. I also began to feel an overwhelming anger against this journalist who was now safe and free from the danger of being tortured by the police. On the other hand, my friend would not only be mistreated by mistaking him at the beginning with the director, but they would end up realizing the truth of the facts the next day when the Embassy X notified the government about the director that had been given asylum. While I was thinking about all these things, this man who was with me was chattering in the most unbearable way. I wasn't paying attention to him, but I managed to catch a phrase with which he ended a speech. "The fight for the freedom of press is certainly bitter." This phrase fell on me in such a way that I could not help but feel an indescribable contempt for all conspirators of this type, men who always used the feelings of others to come out well and safe and then thrive on the sacrifice of others. "Bastard!" I yelled at him, filled with anger. "What did you say?" he asked, surprised. I grabbed him by the lapels, pushed him against the wall and pouring onto him all the hatred contained in my mind, I said that you are a bastard. I tell you now that you and your whole collection of bastards can go to hell with your freedom of press. My friend has nothing to do with these crap. The risk that I take does not matter because I am with you just to see how to save myself. I am as shameless and as hypocritical as you. But I am no longer delusional. And if I help you now, it is because I need to help myself. What I had to do is break your face and hand you over to the police so that they can finish you off. I worry about my friend and not about you and your stupidity. Come on, you idiot, there in the embassy awaits you coffee, brandy, cigarettes and a comfortable bed so that you can dream of all the glory that I will fabricate with the article in which I will write about this. The strange thing was that, besides anger, I felt a certain compassion for this man. He was one of that legion of delusionals who in the early days of the revolution had considered it impossible for an adventurer to seize power. What irritated me the most was that he was locked in the dream that the people were going to defend what until then was traditional in that country and that no one had dared to touch. But the facts had already shaken him. And now he was little less than being lost, not knowing what to do but ask for help from whoever wanted to give it to him, like my friend. When we were in a taxi, I made sure no one was following us. In any case, for better safety we changed taxi several times. During these maneuvers he began to show signs of fear and wanted to start a conversation. I said abruptly, "Shut up." But I did not let him continue. We took the first taxi that passed, and we left for the Embassy of X. "Do you have money with you?" I asked the director. He took out his wallet and said to me, "How much do you need?" All of that I said and snatched the wallet from his hand. "I'll be left without a cent, but with the skin without a scratch and with a crown of laurels. Pay something at least. You can obtain money anywhere. This money will go to those boys who have lost their freedom and perhaps even their health because of you. You are on the side of so and so," he said while naming the dictator. "Think what you want. I don't care about anything anymore." I handed him over to the embassy. I consulted with the officials to what extent could I expand on my writings. We made an agreement and I wrote it right there. I was very happy when the ambassador told me that under international law, I could not include a political interview with the refuge. I was grateful for that, at least it diminished the amount of lies I would write about him. I had painted him as a hero, as a bold man who had managed to outwit the dictator's henchmen. The Ambassador X, one of the few sober and sensible men who was then in diplomacy in that country, smiled when I showed him my article. "Why don't you make a living writing detective novels?" He told me, 52 at that moment arrived a boy with coffee, brandy, cigarettes, and sandwiches. Shortly after, the ambassador's secretary arrived with the refuge. He looked at me reproachfully and I realized that he knew about the incident and about the money. He asked for a word alone with the ambassador, but I went ahead and said, "Mr. Ambassador, a friend I care a lot for is now possibly in the hands of the police so that this man can be saved. This individual is for me a news and nothing more." In the taxi I took his money. Here it is and I put the wallet on the table. I haven't counted it, but I'm going to keep it and how I use it is my business. In this article you have seen how I say that this man, in a final gesture, gave a large sum to help the cause and those who fight for freedom. Well, I'm going to turn that fame into a literal truth. You are witnesses that this man now makes this donation voluntarily. The ambassador was uncomfortable and upset. The secretary, surprised at my boldness. The refuge looked at me with his mouth open. But the most surprised of all was me. I do not want in any way to justify myself by denigrating those revolutionaries of Saloon, but neither can I fail to mention that they already produced an unbearable disgust, and that this disgust was spreading towards myself. I realized that I was hitting a fallen man, a man who had entrusted his life and his freedom in my hands. My feelings were extremely contradictory. I looked at him threateningly, and with a tone of voice that I would never have suspected in myself, I said, "Well, what do you say?" And he, starting a little awkwardly, looked at the ambassador and answered me. "I understand that the unexpectedness of your friend's decision has upset you. I certainly forgive you for the way you have treated me. You are a noble being who is trying to hide your nobility. Have this money and allow me to thank you for everything." He extended his hand. I felt such disgust that I could barely give him mine. I felt dirty inside, dirty at heart. And it seems I spoke this within myself. I have told you that I am anything but noble and selfless. I'm as much a liar and a shameless as yourself. At least let's not be hypocrites. The ambassador intervened at that moment. "If I didn't know you, I would ask you to leave right now. You are disturbed. Do not drink any more. As for your friend, even if the gentleman voluntarily turned himself into the police, no one can help him. I certainly cannot do it without making my government an open supporter of his acts. Let's finish this matter. Officially, I only know that the man has come to ask me for asylum and I grant it to him. Apart from this, I don't know anything else." We exchanged half a dozen formal sentences. The refuge left with the secretary. The ambassador closed the door and we were alone. We chatted for a long time about things that do not pertain to this story. When we said goodbye, he said to me, "All I'm asking is that you don't turn the embassy into a hotel. We have already been through this in Spain and I am a bit old for these things." That night I couldn't sleep pondering about the fate of my friend. I tried to locate a spy we had in the police force. I couldn't find him. But early next morning, my friend showed up at my house. My eyes were sore from lack of sleep, from the excess of alcohol that I had drunk during the entire night. His smile encouraged me, and I threw my arms around him and was about to cry with joy. But he calmed me down with his tranquility. "Don't lose your head." We prepared coffee. Before breakfast he made me have an aspirin and advised me, "You could use a Turkish bath. It will be interesting to see that chubby policeman sweating along with us." He was referring to an agent who was following my steps. I told him everything that had happened the night before, and I expected him to reproach me, but all he said to me was, "You have already begun to realize that the freedom that everyone talks about is a myth made by themselves and for themselves. You have started to be honest with yourself. What you now feel as a reproach is precisely the first dawn of freedom, but I have stolen his money, I have abused his condition. I have enough money, and I have also left the ambassador in an uncomfortable situation. Sometimes we know a lot by heart, but our mental ineptitude distorts everything. But it does not matter. The interesting thing is that you have not hidden behind some high-sounding phrase to justify your violence. As for the ambassador, don't worry. He has seen you as I see you. He is one of us. Who are us? What is it about? I asked. You will recognize them with time. He who has eyes to see always recognizes his own. On the other hand, you will need that money. I think that my friend could predict the future. None of his predictions had failed so far. This one neither. As soon as the word spread out regarding what I had done, about helping the director to escape, my life suffered another unexpected turn. The obscure part of my conduct, naturally, remained in silence. The riots in the city were increasing. The students disturbed with one strike after another. One day 2 of them came to my house. My friend helped me to make them flee to a neighboring country. He took the money that I had taken from the director, who was already writing about his heroism abroad, and his fantasy exceeded mine by far, and divided it between us both. I was blown away by seeing him take charge of the whole situation and hearing him say that I should now dedicate myself to misleading the police so that he could have his hands free in this task. Soon we had to rent an apartment in another part of the city. For several weeks we both played Scarlet Pimpernel. My money ran out quickly. Fuel was rationed, but my friend managed to get coupons. We used diplomatic and attorney cars for our enterprise. When I saw that the money was running out, I began to obtain it through threats to the gentlemen of the aristocratic club, where they were planning the way to give moral support to these students. Spies with whom I was still in contact have joined our undertaking and even contributed with money. My friend assumed the effective and real direction of the whole system that was being set up swiftly. He had such an inconspicuous way of doing things that no one would have thought that all plans were made by him. As for me, my nerves were destroyed. My friend limited himself to observing me. I increased the dose of stimulants to stay awake and active. During the day I had to carry out my role as a journalist as if nothing abnormal was happening. At night I had to help my friend. I learned many things out of necessity. One day, in a quiet hour when we could chat, I told my friend how bad I felt inside, how much disgust was already produced in me by this life of deceit, lies and frights. He limited himself to smiling. A few days later the hour of disillusionment has arrived. One morning, towards the end of the summer, a police party arrived at my house. One of them, while the others went through my drawers, cut the phone, and carried out their job of isolating me, prepared breakfast for everyone. They were all very nice, very kind. Only one was sitting on a sofa with an automatic gun in his hand. The extraordinary thing is that during all of this I began to feel calm, serene. And I said to the armed policeman, "Friend, put away your gun. I assure you, I am too tired to resist or even to try to run away." My house was taken over by the police. I went to a police station where they subjected me to the most absurd interrogations possible. Judging by the way the questions were being asked, and judging by the questions themselves, it seemed like they needed to build such a sensational case that it would serve as the basis for something equally sensational. They were about to persuade me that I was the most dangerous man alive. But I no longer had any resistance, neither internal nor external. Lacking the stimulant, my nervous system was resting. I said yes to everything and didn't bother to deny anything. The charges were so fantastic that I would sign statement after statement without even reading them. This is how my life ended. My career also. I expected to see myself involved in one of those scandalous articles similar to those that I myself had written many times. And I laughed. I thought it would be fair to serve as a topic sometime, and I did not care at all what I knew the newspapers would say about me, or what my colleagues would think. I didn't give a damn about anything. I just wanted to rest. But the police took it upon themselves to stop the scandal in time. Sometime later, I learned from my friend that they had ordered the newspapers to say that I was not detained and that I was possibly spending the summer somewhere. The real reason for this decision was only known to me, but it is a matter so murky that it does not correspond to this story, and my friend did not intervene in this matter at all. During the first days of solitary confinement in a cell, I tried to remember many of the things that my friend had told me and that I had written down. But I didn't have my notebook with me. I began to see life and human issues in a very curious way, as if I was isolated from them. This was because at one point I remembered something he had told me about the key to the Sermon on the Mount, a key that was hidden in the first sentences. And seeing the crowds, he went up the mountain. My disillusions and everything that had contributed to this, could that be seeing the crowds that my friend spoke about? And what could climb the mountain mean? I thought that the mountain would be something like the inner calmness that invaded me when I remembered my friend, a calmness as if I knew that he would give me the answer to all the questions that I began to ask myself. By the way, in this isolation I was able to see the revolution, my career, my years of youth, in a very different way. I realized how foolish, how useless my hectic existence had been, that such a life could not lead anywhere, and that it made no sense. I could not explain what had happened to the feelings of those students who, frightened by the danger of the police, had come to my house seeking help. I could not explain myself how it was possible that now and voluntarily they were speaking against me in the indictment. Eventually I was sent to jail and was left in peace. My friend's first visit occurred in the presence of the interrogating commissioner. I asked him about friends, and his response was typical. "I am here," he said. "I don't mean you. I meant friend X, Y, Z, etc." He looked at me compassionately, and with a fictitious tone he replied, They are free men. They are enjoying a nice nap. I imagine they are doing well. The only one who is doing really well is you. But this you don't understand yet." And addressing the police interrogator, he said, "This man needs rest. Above all, he needs to reflect. Could you help him? Since you have studied philosophy, perhaps some of your words will serve him." I do not know what previous conversations my friend had had with this policeman. The point is that they seemed to be trusted friends. The policeman, clearing his throat and in the tone of a lecturer who is going to elucidate the mystery of life, began to speak such a mass of emptiness that I had to hide my laugh by lighting a cigarette. I didn't dare to look my friend in the eyes. The speech ended more or less as follows. "We provide a service to the state for the good of the community. The homeland is above all. But we are also human. You have confessed. It has saved us work and money. As long as the authorities pass judgment on your case, I'll see to it that you have a good time. The political crimes deserve our courteous consideration. This is like a boxing match. You have lost, we have won. That is all." His hypocrisy was disgusting. I had seen some of the faces of the students who had come to my house for help, and I realized that my friend had somehow influenced this man to convince himself with his own words. The policeman brought out a chess set. He ordered coffee for everyone and the game began. It lasted several hours and I could tell that my friend was playing a comedy game. He pretended to strive to win, but he deliberately lost. In the end, the policeman told him, "We must play again. How difficult it was to defeat you." The man was radiant. During the game I had often seen him turn pale. In the end, he said very kindly, "This victory must be celebrated. Please accept my invitation to dinner." My friend looked at me before answering, but the policeman added, We will go with him too, but it would be good if he pledged his word of honor that he will not try to escape. My friend said. I answer for him. The prison food was obnoxious, so I relished the idea of dinner at a good restaurant. The policeman took from his desk drawer the small metal safe where I always had a good sum of cash and which the police had seized for investigation. I saw him put a handful of bills in his pocket. The three of us ate well and happily. My friend was a completely different person. He seemed to admire this policeman as a child admires his father. The conversation started between the policeman and me. Seeing him so vain, I said, "Look, my career as a journalist has ended thanks to you. But I think I have discovered a possibility for the future. Tell me your most interesting investigations, and putting that together with the background I have from the Secret Service, I could write a good adventure novel. This is a type of literature not very developed in our countries. I will think about it," he said seriously. After a moment, he added, "Yes, I think you could write it well. I have read your writings and I like your style." "Thank you," I said. "How would you describe me?" "Well, it would be necessary to change your name first, right? But in such a way that one can know who it is. Then the description of your physique would have to be modified. Those are important details. I think it would be better if the character was described by you, because you have more experience in the psychology of counter-espionage. I only know that of the spy, and we cannot say it is very good since I am a prisoner. I think it is a good idea. What do you think?" he asked my friend. I started to tremble. Any caustic expression on his part could make my situation worse. I looked at him with pleading eyes. And he, without taking his eyes off me, replied, "Whoever ignores his own psychology, ignores that of others. This is obvious, right?" Of course," said the policeman, looking very seriously at the tablecloth as if pondering over some serious philosophical problem. My friend continued, "Since ignorance of oneself makes one see the truth always distorted so that not even a shadow of it remains, I think there is a notable difference between your psyche and that of my friend. For the purposes of that novel, whose hero is a counter-espionage agent, you are the most suitable to be described, because that way you will distort not even a little your own subjective conception. Naturally, I may be wrong. You saw that when I had you in check, you faithfully demonstrated that quality that I just mentioned. If I'm wrong, please tell me." The policeman seemed to have elevated to the clouds. His smile was so beatific that I had to make a great effort to contain my laughter. He pondered my friend's words with such an expression of seriousness that at first I thought he had realized that, in short, my friend had called him imbecile. But my fears were unfounded. At the end, raising his head like someone who has made a very serious determination, he told us, "Your observations are extremely accurate. Of course, you are not wrong. My subjective conception is precisely one of the psychological values that have allowed me to have an extraordinary success in my career. As you well said, the enormous difference between my psyche and that of the gentleman, it didn't stop calling my attention that about gentlemen, allows me precisely such a subjective conception that the affiliation, excuse the police terminology, of the hero of the counter-espionage service results in the interesting chapter." I was looking at him with my mouth open, but he continued, "Don't be surprised, dear adversary," he told me. "I was born with a great psychological talent. The truth is that I had a hard time persuading my superiors to adopt the psychological method for our service. The categorical imperative makes unnecessary the old methods full of brutality. The psyche is an important factor in espionage and counter-espionage. You lost this round, dear opponent, because you are only an amateur in matters of the psyche. You should not have departed from your profession as a journalist." This man fell madly in love with the words psyche and subjective. During my imprisonment I could hear him many times explaining them to his subordinates. My friend handled him as he pleased. He obtained from him what he wanted, but he never made the slightest effort to obtain my freedom. And when I reproached him about it, he said, "You are better here than out there. At least here you are well accompanied and you may even wake up." Months passed. How many games of chess did my friend have to play with that man? But we have come to the end of this story. One afternoon my friend came to the prison and said to me, "So and so, the one with the subjective psyche, told me that you will be deported in 2 weeks, or maybe sooner. He will treat you well until then. I must go, but we will see each other soon." I couldn't hide my tears. It was obvious that he was also sad, but he was so well protected by his smile and serenity that he revealed nothing but affection and goodwill. It was then that he spoke to me about those qualities indicative of the promise of awakening. I was left alone and bitter. After 10 days I was notified of my dismissal. I was also informed that my affiliation had been sent to all the police of all the governments of the continent and that several of them, each one in his own way, had added or deleted something obtained from reserved and confidential sources. I well knew who constituted these sources and the motives for their contribution to my dossier, but that no longer matters. That entire time period is now so remote for me that it is difficult to remember some incidents. The trickery of some men is in certain cases such an obvious thing that perhaps that is what my friend refers to when he talks about the men of clay in the writing that follows this one. But the last scene by his side also needs to be told, as well as what such determined. One morning in May I left on an international train bound for a bordering country, precisely the country that had sent that nice and scoundrel confidential agent who gave me my wallet. An hour before sending me to the train, the categorical imperative of the subjective psyche led me to his office and in a solemn tone he told me, "Young man, if it were up to me, I would let you free. I would have done that a long time ago. Overall, once his game is discovered, the spy is useless if not dead. That's what matters to me. You can remake your life according to your wishes. That is the general argument of my most important counter-espionage investigations. I make you appear as the most difficult of all." Naturally, I had to exaggerate the note in this case in order to bring your psyche to the level of mine. I recommend you not to alter anything in the chapter in which I write about my psyche. I have concealed myself as much as possible. Good luck, and send me copies of what you will produce. I am at your service. He changed his tone, went back to his desk, took the money out of my safe and added, "As for your trip, the law allows you to take out of the country only that much pesos. When you were arrested, there were so many pesos in this box, 7 times the amount that the law allowed me to carry. In consideration of the sympathy you have aroused, I will allow you to take double the amount that the law authorizes. So much more than half of the original sum has been spent on your living expenses, haircuts, etc. The rest you can use as you please." As nothing could surprise me anymore, I said to him, "Surely another spy with the psyche as low as mine will fall into your hands. Please use the remainder of my money for him as a gift from one colleague to another. Perhaps he will have no money." He gave me the money, the passport, etc. And without waiting for me to leave, he took the balance and put it in his pocket. We said goodbye, but when I was at the door I turned and said, "I am going to travel to the border with one of your men. Which one of us will keep this money?" I had good reason to doubt the altruism of the policeman. According to the law, the agent who accompanies you must keep it and give it to you at the border. But in your case we will make an exception. And he called the agent who was waiting at the door with the handcuffs ready to put them on my hands. "This detainee is in your charge by order of the minister. And he carries Z pesos. That has been officially authorized. He will take the money. Is that understood? In addition, you will not need to handcuff him. Go as friends." "Yes, sir," the agent replied. When we were leaving, he called the agent again and I could hear him say, Surely you will want to buy something special on this trip. Have this. It was obvious that he had given him a part of the funds that I had left to future spies dispossessed of subjective psyche. The agent came out beaming, and with the greatest of considerations, he took my suitcase and said, "Whenever you are ready, sir." The trip lasted 2 days and 1 night. During the trip I have often repeated to myself, and seeing the crowds, without succeeding in getting anything clear except a complete disillusionment about the human race and myself, I had to travel for 5 more days and cross 2 countries before reaching the place where I wished to reside and where I hoped to find work as a journalist. Upon reaching the border I said goodbye to the agent. He was a good guy. I remained alone in the train cabin. I thought of my friend. I had too many dilemmas that I didn't know how to deal with. My reputation was in tatters. It would be difficult for me to find a job in a position of responsibility like the one I had held. Like many, I had been one more victim in that enormous machine that is the total war. Apart from my friend, I was not in contact with any other of my friends. And I waited confidently for the moment to see him again, because if he had promised it, I was certain that he would fulfill it. Unexpectedly, at a station past the border, he got on the train. "Have you learned enough already?" He told me. "Let's see if you can take advantage of this lesson. You may still have to suffer as a result of all that you have done. But don't despair. Try to pay attention to that internal judge I told you about. If you do so, if you do not undertake anything new, over time the inertia of the things that you have set in motion will end." That was the last thing he said to me. He handed me the notebook of the things that I had written down, and I did not hear from him again except when I received the letter that I later on reproduced and that he asked me to publish in part. Upon arriving in the city where I had to make certain arrangements to continue my journey, I found the same political situation that I had just left behind. The day after my arrival I received a visit from that confidential agent, the one with the wallet. "I am pleased that you have come," he told me. "Here we can use your services." "Thanks for reminding me," I replied, "but I am tired." And I explained my personal situation, my obligations and the suffering that I had already caused to my own people. "Don't worry about it," he insisted. "Your experience will be valuable to us. There is nothing risky. Besides, we will pay you well." I reiterate my gratitude, but I prefer to continue traveling. But he, changing his tone, said to me, "You are not in a position to refuse our request. If we wanted, we could detain you again as a suspect. You know well what our situation is, and I assure you that we are not going to allow diplomatic friends to help you. You don't have friends here, you have very little money and you won't be able to find a job. Anyway," I said, "I suppose you are not going to take advantage of my condition to force me to do something I don't want to do." "The homeland is above all," he replied. I couldn't contain a sneering smile. "I know that here constitutional guarantees are suspended, that you must protect yourself under a permanent state of siege. I know that I am in a disproportionate situation and that I depend on you to be able to return to my own people. But even so, believe me also that I prefer to be killed before continuing on this train of farce and lies." The man turned pale. He slapped me on the face and I, who only a few months earlier would have killed him right there, kept steady and did not say or do anything. Something strange happened inside me, something I cannot explain, and yet it was not fear. It was something very unique. As I smiled, I perceived a great calm in my chest. The man was embarrassed, made half a dozen more threats, and withdrew. From the hotel balcony I saw him sit on a bench in the public square. After a few moments, while I was shaving, he returned. "Excuse me," he said, "I should have taken into account all that you just suffered. But please accept the invitation of the minister," he quoted a name, "to have lunch. Maybe then you will change your mind." I didn't refuse. The reason for the lunch was very simple. There was a conspiracy going on to overthrow the president and place the minister in his place. For this it was necessary to examine certain environments. I explained to him that professionally I was discredited. We can fix that easily, he told me. He named an opposition newspaper and gave me to understand that the owners, who also owned large interests in the country's natural wealth, would not look down on my collaborations. No, I said, I'm tired of all that. Think about it for a few days anyway. In my office I have a very interesting dossier about you and your political ideas. I also realize that you are discreet. It was a threat that could not go unnoticed. I was once again in the networks of one of those abominable political intrigues of the South American countries, a machine full of lies, crimes and extortion. Disappointed, that afternoon I thought about suicide. I felt that I was drowning. I couldn't run even if I wanted. The police were watching me. I took a tram and left for the outskirts of the city. By the attitude of the people, by the way they spoke, and by many indications that an experienced observer easily learns to take into account, I realized that anyone who would start a movement against the current president could succeed. People also wanted to enjoy the freedom to change rulers. Later, they would again want to overthrow whoever they themselves had brought to power. The years of lies added to more lies had ended up making me feel contempt not only towards myself, but towards the entire human race. However, something inside me was changing and I noticed that my contempt was not so caustic nor so powerful. It was something like resignation when seeing people. I repeated to myself, and seeing the crowds, I would ponder upon that, but my thoughts would flew to my friend and I forgot this. Suddenly, I was seized with a vehement desire to pray. I found a chapel filled with indigenous people. I watched them and felt affection towards them. I knelt in a corner and began to chat, as before, with a crucified Christ. I told him in detail everything that happened to me, and I finished by saying this. Judging by the facts, it seems that I used very badly the intelligence you gave me. Why don't you give me a new chance? If you can, give me another kind of intelligence, one that not only allows me to get out of this mess, but also allows me to live in peace with my friend. I raised my eyes to the face of the Christ. I don't know if it was the imagination spurred on by the desire, but I think I saw him smile. When I returned to the city, late at night, I took refuge in the hotel room. On the nightstand I found a message from an ex-diplomat whom I had met many years before and who now bore the title of senator on his letterhead. I called the number indicated and he answered himself. He was very kind. He told me that he had found out about my visit to the city, that he missed my reports in the newspapers and that he had a keen interest in talking to me. He offered to come to the hotel to pick me up. I no longer felt any strength to refuse. When we were together our cordiality was artificial. The man knew about everything, but he was hiding it. A senator does not look for a journalist in that way, only seeks to remember times gone by in a nice capital city. Our talk, during the drive, was more hollow than normal. Eventually the luxury car in which we were driving stopped in front of the government house. The senator smiled, as if to mean, "You weren't expecting this, huh?" We had dinner in the presidential dining room. I had no appetite. The shot didn't come until later, when the senator, the president, and I were alone in a small private saloon. It was about a new intrigue, but this time it had to be bigger. I had to go to a certain country, activate there a given newspaper campaign that would allow this president to unite the forces of his party and eventually the whole country. If it is necessary, he said, we can even mobilize. The idea of a new possibility of war frightened me. But I kept calm and decided to tell him about my observations of the day, among the people. During all this time I was wondering whether or not they would be informed of the conspiracy that was in the very bosom of their own cabinet. I ignored this and began to explain that he was unpopular not because of himself but because the people lacked the necessary civic education, which made him an easy victim of any exalted person. Both the president and the senator spoke to me about their deep love for the country, the sacrifices they had made, the sacrifices they still had to make, and how necessary it was now to galvanize the opinion of the country by making it see the danger of its enemies, etc., etc. I did not answer. I felt disgusted. When I left the palace, I did not go to the hotel in the luxurious car, but on foot. Days and weeks passed. My efforts to continue my journey encountered obstacles on all sides. One Sunday, I remember well, started that orgy of blood that lasted for several days. I heard the first shootings from the hotel. Afterwards there was a macabre dance, and during it I saw, in the middle of a frenzied and delirious mob in their drunkenness of blood, the corpse of the president, mutilated. Rivers of blood flowed. No one was sure about anything. One night I met a fellow countryman. He told me that he had taken advantage of the shooting to escape from the jail where he had been imprisoned for a few months. The shooting could resume at any moment, so we decided to steal a car and together we fled at full speed towards the border. Time passed and I found a humble job. One day I received the announced letter from my friend, indicating the part that needs to be published along with other texts. The pertinent part reads like this: The feathered serpent must fly. When you know what the flight of the feathered serpent is, you will know what you have to do. Until then, make it known that the message of the immortals vibrates throughout the centuries. Wake up. Know yourself. The mysterious impulse that fixes your attention on these manuscripts is but the echo of the cry that has awakened the immortal essence of your own blood. And by evoking the glorious forces of life, you have also evoked the sinister forces of death. Both of them are yourself, so do not fear. Face them, know them, subdue them. Your destiny is to be the master of both. And even though you often think that you have lost the path that leads to awakening, you will never be alone. And you losing the way is nothing but a testing ground with which your alert intelligence, shaking the lethargy of everything that is mortal, attempts shy steps on all tracks. It is necessary that you obtain experience. Never ask a man, "What should I do?" because it is the most harmful of all questions. If you ask a fool, a sleeping person, you will be inviting him to drag you into sleep. By so doing, you will have fallen into double foolishness, and it will be twice more difficult to wake up again. And if you ask a wise person, an awakened one, you will notice how useless it is to ponder over his answer, because an awakened person will always answer. Do what you think is best. If you put all your heart into it, always acting with alertness, you will gain a great experience at the end. You will make out of solitude and silence your most precious companions. Immersing yourself with them in the depths of yourself, you will gradually see all the horror of the dream, which is your human slavery. And, hence, your power to claim your freedom will increase. Not everyone chooses this path that leads to the very heart of things. If you have summoned your friends, you have also put on guard your worst enemies. Both will appear within you and before you in 1,000 different ways, and you will often confuse them during your first steps. Your friends will not always be the most pleasant or kind because they will deprive you of everything that you now consider stable. Then your enemies, jealous and smiling, will unfold before your inner vision 1,000 possibilities to elevate you to your actual condition. And if you give in and bite the poisonous fruit that they will offer you, you will be imprisoned and subject to the triple chain of illusion and dream that always seizes the naive one who ignores the value of experience and opposition. But you will soon meet your friends in the infinite silences to which you will throw yourself, anxious and thirsty for words of truth. Then you will feel that something is flowing, rough or smooth, depending on the circumstance, and the mere fact of feeling it will indicate that you are on the path to a full awakening. Because that verb, that something, is you yourself, the master, the creator. Study this drawing attentively. With it you will learn to use all your faculties to awaken. Each link in the chain of the immortals contributes 1 grain more to alleviate the load of those who are coming behind, but each soul that ventures into this singular endeavor is an original experiment of life in order to make of this planet Earth a world of divine vigilance as well. Each man who aspires to this vigil must make his own track and walk alone, attentive only on the step of the instance, without worrying about victory or defeat, without worrying about his earthly end. This is to live in the eternal now, otherwise, the experience of man on planet Earth would have no value. The path begins in the body with the 5 senses. To wake them up is to use them, and not to confuse them with you. Until now you have thought that your 5 senses inform you about the outside world. It is not like that. There is no such outer world nor is there such inner world. These are illusory concepts that cannot penetrate beyond the forms. That which is real is that you are not a form, and that being life, you are everything that there is. Observe that bows and arrows do not point in one sole direction, but in 2 simultaneously. Understanding and living this simultaneity is the first rebellion of the mind, a rebellion that at the end will wake you up fully. And if you delve a little into what this simultaneity tries to express, you will soon also notice that you are not a body, but that which lives in your body, that animates your body, and that, lacking in better expression, here I will call it your God self, invisible. With your 5 senses, attributes of the personal self, of the ego form, it is not given to you to penetrate beyond the surface of forms. When you are aware that God self is the one who uses your 5 senses, it will be given to you to penetrate into the meaning, the essence, the spirit of all things that is also God self. Latent in the brain, permeating the brain, is that which is called mind, that with which you can know what your 5 senses capture and who captures it for them. More deeply still, I have drawn the heart, at the very center of your whole life. From this center, extended to the mind, your individual I will spring forth, the essence of your soul longing to live in spirit and to worship truly. Observe also that thought and feeling connect your personal I with your individual I, and I have placed them in the light half of the vital circle, the awakened consciousness, because they can be the light that reflects the truth of yourself in the darkness of your personality. And because they are the senses of true wakefulness, they are the ones that, by uniting in what is called the Holy Spirit, establish the waking contact with God Self in you and God Self outside of you, one God but the Father God, with whom you can commune, helped by Christ, the Lord. If in your heart does not burn an uneasiness that permeates you until the consummation of your body, you will not be able to invoke God nor the Holy Spirit. And you don't know how to ask, which is why your time has not yet come. Watch and pray was the heritage that Christ left to the courageous. To watch is to do everything awakened, to pray is to feel an ardent yearning of being, but whoever prays and whoever watches, even when they do it in an imperfect way, will receive generous help and will have to learn to receive it generously as well. The help is here, and it is now.